With Hitler still clinging to Stalingrad, HQ 6th Army backed down at the decisive hour, contrary to the Army Group's instructions, from taking what was possibly the very last chance of salvation. With that, the Army's fate was as good as settled. Hitler's ideal of still being able to relieve it at a later date by bringing up an SS Panzer Corps from Kharkov in January was illusory from the first. What followed in the Stalingrad pocket after 4th Panzer Army's attacks had come to a standstill was indeed the death struggle of 6th Army. Yet in view of the fact that the other part of the Army Group's mission was still to prevent the destruction of the southern wing as a whole, it was not until this struggle had reached its closing stages that we could justifiably attempt to cut it short and thereby curtail the losses and suffering of the doomed army by recommending a capitulation. The battles to save 6th Army were, of course, closely bound up with developments on the whole of the German southern wing. My object in considering the latter separately in a later chapter is to give greater clarity to the various operational considerations involved. The situation facing the Army Group on its assumption of command differed very little from that of 24th November. The enemy had obviously committed his main forces primarily in the ring enclosing 6th Army. Of the 143 Soviet formations reported in the Army Group area, some 60 at least had been employed all along on the encirclement of the army. The latter's southern front was subjected to a heavy attack on 28th of November, but this the army managed to beat off. On all its other fronts at the end of November, there was only localized fighting, in the course of which the defences became more firmly established. Nevertheless, it was clear that any attempt to break out just then would have run into powerful opposition, and the stocks of ammunition and fuel still available in the pocket would inevitably have been used up. Even if the initial breakthrough had come off, the army would have reached the Don without ammunition or fuel at a time when there could be no relief group at hand. Otherwise, the enemy was busy feeling his way forward against the thin screens being thrown across the gaps to the south and west of Stalingrad, behind which the relief forces were to complete their assembly. The Army Group's immediate problem was to obtain the clearest possible picture of the condition and intentions of 6th Army. What it had been able to discover from OKH and Army Group B at a distance of several hundred miles was obviously not enough. As early as 16th November, I had been handed a letter from General Paulus by an officer who had flown out of the pocket. See Appendix, Verm. In it, Paulus stressed the necessity of having freedom of action in an extreme emergency, since a situation calling for an immediate breakout to the southwest was liable to arise any day or hour. The information which this letter neglected to give on the Army's supply position was provided in a report furnished by General Pickert, a Luftwaffe officer who had himself just flown out of the pocket, having been detailed by the commander of 4th Air Fleet, Colonel General Baron Wiese Richthofen, to organise the airlift. According to Pickert, the army had enough rations, albeit on short issue, for 12 days. Ammunition stocks were at 10–20% of the normal scale, which corresponded to the amount that would be expended in one day's intensive fighting. The vehicle fuel was only enough for minor troop movements and would not suffice to concentrate the tanks for a breakout. If these figures were correct, one could only wonder how 6th Army had proposed to implement the breakout plan of which it had given notice 4 days previously. In the light of this information, I resolved to fly into the pocket and talk to Paulus myself. However, my Chief of Staff and Chief of Operations finally prevailed on me to abandon the idea, as it seemed more than likely from the state of the weather, that I should be detained there for 2 days or more. To be away for all that time was inadmissible in view of the tense situation and the need to keep OKH constantly aware of the Army Group's views, so I dispatched my Chief of Staff, General Schultz, instead, and on a later occasion my Chief of Operations, Colonel Busse. Schultz's mission was primarily to gain a first-hand impression of the situation and condition of 6th Army and its command staff, and to brief the Army commander on the plans for raising the siege. In this way, the latter was to be given an opportunity to comment on the prospects and timing of the operation. Everything depended on harmonizing Paulus's views with our own, as it was clear that in the absence of telephone lines or any reliable means of written communication, the Army Group could exert only a limited influence on Sixth Army's decisions. The need for complete understanding was increased by the existence of the OKH liaison officer, whose presence at the Army headquarters kept it under the constant sway of Hitler's thoughts and orders. Apart from revealing his deep but only too understandable depression over a situation for which not he but the Supreme Command was responsible, Paulus's letter seemed to me, in the desire it expressed for freedom of action in an extreme emergency, to indicate that he intended breaking out of the pocket if the position there became untenable. This might either be because the enemy had already penetrated or even broken through one or more of the army's fronts, so that the tactical situation had become untenable, or else because the strength of the troops was giving out. In either case, to my mind, an attempted breakout could end only in catastrophe. In the situation that now prevailed, two things were of fundamental importance. First, there must be a stubborn defence to keep the army in existence. Next must come a breakthrough, not launched as a forlorn hope, but deliberately timed to take place when the army still had the strength to carry it out, and also to coincide with relief operations from outside the pocket. Such were the views which Schultz had to put over to Paulus. The overall impression he brought back with him, and this was later confirmed by Colonel Busse, was that Sixth Army, provided it were properly supplied from the air, did not judge its chances of holding out at all unfavourably. That such an attitude could also be dangerous would be seen later on. With that, I come to the question of whether an airlift to Sixth Army could really be contemplated. In our report to OKH from Starobielsk on 24th November, I had been at pains to point out how crucial this was. Only if a guarantee of air supplies were given, I had said, could we afford to delay a breakout until the intervention of relief forces improved the army's chances of escape. By refusing to sanction Paulus's request for a breakout the day before my telephone conversation, Hitler had to all intents and purposes already given that guarantee. His refusal had been based on an assurance from Göring, whose staff was indeed the sole authority competent to assess the Luftwaffe's ability to keep Sixth Army supplied at Stalingrad. On assuming command of Don Army Group, I was told by Colonel General Verser Richthofen, whose 4th Air Fleet was in support of us and responsible for supplying Sixth Army from the air, that he did not think an adequate airlift could be flown under the prevailing weather conditions. Even if the weather improved, he said, he still did not believe it would be possible to maintain the lift for any length of time, and had already told Göring as much. Of course, he added, he was in no position to judge the extent of Göring's other resources. The Army Group immediately reported Verser Richthofen's opinion to OKH, but its only reaction was to refer us to forthcoming increases in the strength of the transport squadrons. The same answer was given to our daily reports that the loads flown into the pocket were coming nowhere near the quotas envisaged. These new squadrons arrived right enough, and their crews did their duty with great self-sacrifice. But although the Luftwaffe lost 488 aircraft and about 1,000 men at Stalingrad, it never succeeded in providing Sixth Army with anything like its minimum requirements. It is thus established that the promise Göring gave to Hitler on 23rd November, or possibly even earlier, was entirely unwarranted. Whether it was due to a false appreciation of Luftwaffe potentialities or frivolously given in a desire to show off or humour Hitler, I cannot tell. In any event, the responsibility is Göring's. Nevertheless, Hitler should still have checked up on the reliability of his statements. Besides knowing what sort of person Göring was, he was also well aware of the strength of the Luftwaffe. Unlike Hitler, neither the Army Group staff nor the Chief of 4th Air Fleet were in a position to verify the facts, nor had they any immediate reason for seeing anything wildly impracticable in a short-term airlift. After all, in the winter of 1941, too, the Luftwaffe had provided 100,000 men in the Demyansk pocket with everything they needed. Although in fact twice that number were surrounded this time, it could only be a matter, to our mind, of keeping supplies going for a few weeks or so. As soon as the relief groups drew near to the pocket, 6th Army must in any event break out. To leave it at Stalingrad for a longer period was quite out of the question. All the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe had to do in effect was to make a straightforward calculation. 6th Army's minimum requirement of all types of supplies totalled 550 tons per day, or at least 400 tons, until all ration dumps in the pocket were exhausted. In order to lift 550 tons, if each aircraft made one run daily, we should need 225 Ju-52s, or correspondingly more He-111s, which could carry only 1.5 tons at the outside. The distances to be flown from the air bases of Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya were 110 and 135 miles respectively, though in either case only the last 30 miles would be over enemy territory. Neither of these airfields was lost to the enemy until Christmas 1942, when the fate of 6th Army was already decided. In favourable weather conditions, the aircraft could be expected to make 2 trips each in 24 hours. On the days when this happened, the number of machines needed would be reduced by half. These figures formed the preliminary basis on which the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe had to assess the possibility of supplying 6th Army by air. In addition, however, he had the following factors to consider. First, there was the probability in winter that the squadrons working the airlift would be grounded by weather. The resultant deficit would have to be made up by lifting an extra tonnage on flying days, i.e., the number of aircraft must be proportionately increased. While it was difficult to predict to what extent the weather would prejudice flying, the Luftwaffe meteorologists should be able to turn up certain records from the previous winter. The second factor to be taken into account was that not all machines are ever airworthy at any one given time. This could be seen from statistics. To a large extent, the number of aircraft out of commission depended on what ground crews and maintenance facilities were available at the air bases. This is a subject to which I shall return later. Finally, it had to be remembered that a certain percentage of the transport machines would be shot down or crash. The rate of losses by enemy action was again largely dependent on how much fighter cover the Luftwaffe could provide. The Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe thus had to weigh 2 questions with the utmost care before giving any firm promises about an airlift. Had he any prospect whatever of immediately assembling 550 tons of carrier space, bearing in mind the extra demands imposed by bad weather and the non-availability of aircraft for technical reasons? Could he maintain this figure by a continuous flow of replacements, and above all by providing an appropriate number of fighter and pursuit aircraft to combat the air defences anticipated on the enemy's side, until such time as 6th Army was likely to be relieved? Goering was the only man in a position to give completely satisfactory answers to these questions. Only he was able to tell whether the requisite number of aircraft could be found, and whether their use here was defensible in the light of the Luftwaffe's other commitments. If neither were the case, it was his duty to tell Hitler so point-blank when the decision regarding 6th Army was taken, i.e. around 22nd, 23rd November. It was Goering's further duty, once Hitler had ordered the army to remain at Stalingrad, immediately to throw in the Luftwaffe's very last reserves of carrier aircraft, fighters and repair shops. It is doubtful whether Goering did everything he could have done in this field, and at the beginning of January, as a result of the Army Group's constant references to the inadequacy of the airlift, Hitler ordered Field Marshal Milch to take it over. As the latter had all the forces and resources of the Luftwaffe in Germany at his disposal, he was certainly in a position to improve the airlift's basic efficiency. By now, unfortunately, it was too late from the operational point of view for him to do any good. The same went for the airlift as such, for in the meantime the 2 above-named bases had been lost, and the supplies had to be flown over much longer stretches. As if his original promise of 22nd, 23rd November had not been frivolous enough, Goering proceeded to make things even worse by not exhausting all the possibilities open to him in the first vital weeks of the siege. For that was the time when the bid to save 6th Army might still have had some chance of success. The more debatable and confused the airlift issue became, the more important it was to relieve Sixth Army at the earliest possible date. According to details passed to the Army Group by OKH, the latter was to make the following forces available for this purpose. A. In the framework of 4th Panzer Army, 57 Panzer Corps under General Kirchner, to be moved over from Army Group A, with 6 and 23 Panzer Divisions and 15 Luftwaffe Field Division under command. These forces were scheduled to arrive in the Kotelnikovo area by 3rd December. B. Deploying in the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, a new formation to be known as Army Detachment Hollet, consisting of 62, 294 and 336 infantry divisions, 48 Panzer Corps, General Wiers-Knobelsdorff, with 11 and 22 Panzer divisions, 3 Mountain Division, and 7 and 8 Luftwaffe Field Divisions. This group was to be ready to become operational on the Upper Chir around 5th December. All told, the Army Group expected to have relief forces amounting to 4 armoured divisions, 4 infantry or mountain divisions, and 3 Luftwaffe Field Divisions. It was assumed from the start, of course, that the Luftwaffe divisions could at best be employed in some defensive role, such as shielding the flanks of the assault elements. The forces indicated, assuming that they did become available in this strength and at the times stated, might conceivably suffice to make temporary contact with Sixth Army and to restore its freedom of movement. In no event, however, could they administer a defeat big enough to enable us, as Hitler had put it in the jargon of static warfare, to reoccupy the positions held prior to the attack. On 27th of November, the Army Group received a teleprinter message from OKH, replying to the appreciation of the situation we had submitted 3 days previously. It appeared from this that Hitler was still prejudiced by the ideas already referred to. The reason he gave for deciding to hold fast to Stalingrad was that if we abandoned it now, we should have to try all over again next year, at an even greater cost, to regain what we had sacrificed so much to win in 1942. Quite apart from whether a repetition of the 1942 offensive would be at all expedient or feasible when the time came, the question simply did not arise at the present moment. The real problem was whether the least possibility existed of somehow or other restoring the situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front. Unless Sixth Army were saved, there seemed to be almost no hope of doing so. On 28th of November, therefore, I sent Hitler a detailed appraisal of the position, appending a table which showed the strengths of enemy forces, in all 143 major formations, operating against us. I also gave a clear picture of the situation and condition of Sixth Army, noting in particular that it would shortly be deprived of the use of its artillery through lack of ammunition and loss of mobility. In the circumstances, I said, it was doubtful whether one could afford to wait for all the relief forces to arrive, particularly Army Detachment Hollet. Presumably the relief group of 4th Panzer Army would now have to move off ahead of it. Naturally, nothing decisive could be achieved by this, for everything depended, as we had already pointed out on 24th of November, on the provision of additional forces. The best one could hope to do was to cut a corridor to Sixth Army through which to replenish its fuel and ammunition stocks and thereby restore its mobility. After that, however, the army must be fetched straight out of the pocket, as it could not possibly survive the winter out in the open steppes. Above all, I told Hitler, it was strategically impossible to go on tying down our forces in an excessively small area while the enemy enjoyed a free hand along hundreds of miles of front. What we must regain at all costs was our manoeuvrability, as the solution applied in the case of the Demyansk pocket the previous year was now out of the question. The above appraisal was fully confirmed by later events. It was 3rd December before we received a reply on this fundamental question of operational policy. Just one more example of the way Hitler loved to defer answers which were not to his taste. The reply did state, however, that Hitler agreed with our views. There were only 2 points on which he had any qualifications to make. In the first place, he did not wish the northern front of Stalingrad to be pulled back or shortened for the purpose of finding extra forces. Secondly, While not disputing the number of enemy formations listed in my appreciation, he nonetheless contended that the strength of the Soviet divisions had been reduced and that the enemy command would have trouble in maintaining supplies and proper control as a result of its unexpected successes. He was possibly right regarding the reduction of divisional strengths. This was more than offset, however, by the extent to which our own forces had been weakened in several months' heavy fighting, a subject on which the Army Group had reported in no uncertain terms. That the Soviets were already having supply difficulties was unlikely, and the supposition that they had any control problem was mere hypothesis. At any rate, and this was of paramount importance, it could be assumed from Hitler's general endorsement of our views that he accepted the three essential points. Even in the event of our being able to fight a way through to Sixth Army, the latter could not be left at Stalingrad for any length of time. The army must receive a daily average of supplies by air. As the Army Group had been constantly emphasizing since 21st November, a continuous flow of reinforcements was needed. It will be seen in due course that Hitler really had not the slightest intention of releasing Sixth Army from Stalingrad. Neither were the other two prerequisites for the success of the operation to be fulfilled. The first thing we discovered was that the strength of the forces being provided by OKH for the relief of Sixth Army, as well as the timing of their availability, were by no means in keeping with what we had gathered from the promises made to us in Starobielsk. To begin with, there were considerable delays in transporting the troops to their new areas. In the case of Army Detachment, Hollet, this was due to the low efficiency of the railways, and in that of 4th Panzer Army's relief group, to the fact that while the steppes around Stalingrad were in the grip of an icy frost, a thaw had set in down in the Caucasus. Consequently, the wheeled elements of 23 panzer divisions were unable to move by road as scheduled and had to go by rail instead. At the slow rate of progress this involved, 57 Panzer Corps' operational deadline was put off by several days, in a situation where every single day counted. The strength of the relief groups proved more unsatisfactory still. 15 Luftwaffe Field Division, which was due to join 57 Panzer Corps, had not even been established yet, a process which took several weeks to complete. When finally ready, the division had to be committed to battle at the height of an emergency, at a time, incidentally, when the relief problem had long been decided in the negative sense, and disintegrated during its first few days in action. The army artillery to be handed over by Army Group A, except for one regiment of smoke troops, never arrived at all. Of the total of 7 divisions earmarked for the Hollet Relief Group, we found that it had already been necessary to commit 2 infantry divisions, 62 and 294, on the front of 3rd Romanian Army, to provide it with at least a modicum of stability. Their withdrawal would have led to the immediate collapse of 1 and 2 Romanian Corps battlefronts. Both divisions were thus excluded from the relief operation from the start. Another of the promised formations which failed to put in an appearance was 3 Mountain Division. The first half of it, which had already entrained, was diverted by OKH to Army Group A to deal with a local crisis. The second was retained by Central Army Group for a similar purpose. 22 Panzer Division, which had been thrown in with 3rd Romanian Army at the beginning of the Soviet offensive, proved to be a complete wreck incapable of any offensive action after the losses it had suffered in the November battles. Since it was impossible to employ the Luftwaffe divisions in an offensive role, practically the only striking forces left for the relief operations of 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Hollet, respectively, were 57 Panzer Corps, with a strength of 2 armoured divisions, and 48 Panzer Corps, 11 Panzer Division and 336 Infantry Division, the first of which was still moving up. 17 Panzer Division and 306 Infantry Division, which OKH subsequently brought in to replace the divisions which had failed to arrive, could neither fully compensate for the deficiency of strength nor be ready to go into action as early as the relief operation demanded. In the circumstances, the original idea of relieving Sixth Army from 2 different directions, 4th Panzer Army from the Kotelnikovo area east of the Don and Army Detachment Holit from the Middle Chir towards Kalach, would be invalidated by a shortage of forces. The most we could hope to do now was to assemble sufficient strength at one spot. As things stood, this left only 4th Panzer Army eligible for the attack. It had a shorter mileage to cover to Stalingrad and did not have an obstacle like the Don to negotiate. It was also reasonable to hope that the last quarter from which the enemy would expect a relief offensive was anywhere east of the Don, as the whole situation made it extremely risky for the Germans to assemble large forces in that area. For the very same reason, he had initially put out relatively weak forces in the direction of Kotelnikovo for protection of his siege front. Here, for the time being, 4th Panzer Army was faced with only 5 enemy divisions, whereas the enemy on the Chir had already 15 divisions in the line. The order issued by the Army Group on 1st December for Operation Winter Tempest thus envisaged the following: on a date still to be fixed, but in any case not earlier than 8th December, 4th. Panzer Army was to attack east of the Don with the bulk of its forces, moving off from the area of Kotelnikovo. Once it had thrust through the enemy's covering forces, its task would be to attack and roll up the southern and/or western siege front encircling Stalingrad. A smaller force provided by Army Detachment Holit's 48 Panzer Corps was to thrust from the Don Chir bridgehead of Nizhne Chirskaya into the rear of the enemy covering forces. Should the enemy opposite 4th Panzer Army north of Kotelnikovo be conspicuously reinforced prior to the attack, or should the situation of 4th Romanian Army, whose job was to cover 4th Panzer Army's long eastern flank, take another critical turn, the following alternative plan would come into operation. The armoured divisions of 4th Panzer Army would make a surprise move northwards along the west bank of the Don and launch the main thrust from the Nizhne Chirskaya bridgehead. It was also envisaged that a less powerful shock group should thrust up at Kalash from out of the Don Chir bridgehead west of the Don in order to cut the enemy's communications there and open up the Don Bridge for 6th Army. As regards 6th Army, the orders laid down that on a date after 4th Panzer Army's attack still to be fixed by the Army Group, it would initially break through to the southwest in the direction of the Donskaya Tsaritsa, its aim being to link up with 4th Panzer Army and to take a hand in rolling up the southern and western siege fronts and capturing the Don crossing. On express instructions from Hitler, the army was to continue to hold its existing positions in the pocket. That this would not be possible in practice when it broke out to the southwest to meet 4th Panzer Army was perfectly obvious, for when the Soviets attacked on the northern or eastern fronts, it would have to give way step by step. In the event, undoubtedly, Hitler would have had no choice but to accept this fact, as he did on later occasions. Not that we could say so in the operation order, of course, as Hitler would have learnt of it through his liaison officer at 6th Army headquarters and immediately issued a countermand. During the first few days after my takeover, everything remained fairly quiet on the Army Group front. Evidently, the enemy was preparing a concentric assault on 6th Army. On the other hand, he apparently did not care to venture an immediate thrust on Rostov with strong armoured forces, nor did he even try to go for the Army Group's vital Donetsk crossings or the railway junction of Likaka. Probably he thought he could save himself the risk attaching to a tank drive of this kind, since his preponderance of forces in the large bend of the Don promised to assure him of success in any event. Yet he undoubtedly sacrificed a big opportunity in this way, for at the end of November and in early December, the forces we should have needed for intercepting such a thrust simply did not exist. On 20 December, the enemy made his first attack on 6th Army. Like those which followed on the 4th and 8th of the month, it was bloodily repulsed by the courageous troops in the pocket. Fortunately, the supply position now appeared more favourable than we had originally dared to expect. For on 2nd December the army reported that by existing on a reduced scale of rations and slaughtering a large proportion of the horses, it could, reckoning from 30th November, manage with its present stocks for 12 to 16 days. At the same time, the state of the weather encouraged us to hope for an improvement in the rate of air supplies, a record load of 300 tons being flown into the pocket on 5th December. Unfortunately, this was to remain an all-time high. Nonetheless, it was clear that no time must be lost in making contact with 6th Army on the ground and fetching it out of the pocket. As far as this went, the only thing in our favour to date was that the enemy had not ventured to exploit his chance of severing the Army Group's rear communications at the Donetsk crossings or at Rostov, where he could have simultaneously cut off Army Group A. Otherwise, the position deteriorated badly in the sectors from which the relief thrusts were to be made. In the case of 4th Panzer Army, the arrival of 57 Panzer Corps from the Caucasus was delayed for the reasons already stated. The assembly date, originally 3rd December, was put off till 8th and then till 12th December. Naturally, the enemy was not going to remain inactive over so long a period. On 3rd December, he pushed forward in strength towards Kotelnikovo, 57 Panzer Corps' main railhead, obviously with a view to clearing up the position there. The following day he was driven back by 6th Panzer Division, which had meanwhile become operational. From 8th December onwards, there were signs of a major enemy force gathering on 4th Panzer Army's northern front, northeast of Kotelnikovo, where a new Soviet army, 51st, was identified. On the other hand, things remained quiet on the Panzer Army's eastern front, which was manned mainly by the troops of the subordinate 4th Romanian Army. The same applied to 16 motorized division around Yelista. With a view to setting the Romanians' minds at rest, we made this division dispatch a light motorized force up north to reconnoitre in the rear of the Soviet front facing them. It established beyond all possible doubt that for the time being, the enemy had no forces assembled in any great strength west of the Volga. Events took a much more serious turn in the area of Army Detachment Holit, 3rd Romanian Army's sector. Here, on the lower Chir, from its junction with the Don to a point some 45 miles upstream, the only troops on the ground, apart from a few anti-aircraft groups, were alarm units which had been set up from B-echelon elements and 6th Army men returning from leave. These were later augmented by the 2 Luftwaffe divisions, which, after originally being earmarked for Army Detachment Holit, had been found to be only conditionally employable, owing to their complete lack of battle experience and shortage of trained officers and NCOs. The rent torn between the bend in the Chir at Bolshoi Tarnovsky and the still intact Don front when the Russians broke through 3rd Romanian Army in November had been patched up by bending back the right wing of the 3rd Romanian Army elements on the Don, 1 and 2 Romanian Corps, and by bringing in the badly battered 22 Panzer Division and remnants of the overrun Romanian divisions. In fact, however, the infantry divisions destined for Army Detachment Holit should also have been committed here in order to afford this 75-mile stretch of front a minimum degree of stability. By the beginning of December, there were ominous signs of an impending major offensive on the Chir front, and 2 days later strong enemy artillery was identified along the lower reaches of the river. It was here, on 4th of December, that the Russian attacks began, striking without respite at one point after another. The more the enemy persisted in his attempts to break through, the more critical the situation became. It was absolutely vital that we should continue to hold this stretch of river, as our bridgehead in the angle between the Chir and Don, including the Don Bridge at Nizhne Chirskaya, was of fundamental importance for the relief of 6th Army. Apart from that, an enemy breakthrough over the Chir would have cleared the way to the Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya airfields, which were only 25 and 50 miles away, as well as to the Donetsk crossings and Rostov. In the circumstances, the Army Group had no choice but to agree that 48 Panzer Corps, whose 11 Panzer and 336 Infantry Division had arrived by this time, should temporarily be used to bolster up the front on the lower Chir. The Corps found itself playing the role of a veritable firefighter, dashing from one spot to the next to intervene every time the thin screen of alarm units threatened to collapse. Naturally, this temporarily deprived Army Detachment Holit of the only divisions it could have employed in an offensive relief role from this direction. As soon as the situation permitted, however, it was still intended to bring the corps across the Nizhne Chirskaya Bridge to cooperate with the relief group of 4th Panzer Army. On 9th December, the attacks against 6th Army, in the course of which the enemy had come in for some very rough treatment, started to slacken off. This probably meant that forces were already being released to head off any German attempt to lift the siege. On the Cheer front, the enemy kept up his pressure unremittingly, but on 4th Panzer Army's northern front, after the failure of his Kotelnikovo operation, he displayed a certain degree of restraint. I need hardly say that in this critical situation I was in constant telephonic communication with the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Zeitzler. He entirely agreed with my forecast of developments and the inferences I drew. But whether he would be able to get Hitler to take appropriate and timely action was quite a different matter. Apart from our constant demand for reinforcement of the Luftwaffe transport squadrons working the airlift to 6th Army, there were two outstanding issues. The first was that even if 6th Army could be relieved, it must on no account be left in the Stalingrad area any longer. Hitler himself still wanted to hang on to the city, just as he had insisted on doing with the Demyansk pocket the previous winter, and to keep the army supplied there by means of a land corridor. Don Army Group, on the other hand, was as convinced as ever that this was entirely the wrong solution, and that it was essential to become operationally mobile again if disaster were to be avoided. This tug-of-war continued until the very last chance of saving 6th Army had been thrown away. The second issue was the reinforcement of the relief forces. Ever since the discovery that of the 7 divisions originally promised us for Army Detachment Hollitz's relief bid, we could at best expect to get 48 Panzer Corps with a strength of 2 divisions, it had been vital to strengthen 4th Panzer Army. Anyone could see that the latter was not going to reach Stalingrad with only 6 and 23 Panzer divisions. There were 2 possible ways of effecting this reinforcement. Don Army Group repeatedly asked to be given Army Group A's 3 Panzer Corps of 2 armoured divisions, which should not have been used in mountainous country anyway. On each occasion, the request was refused because Army Group A claimed it could not release the corps unless it were allowed to evacuate a salient projecting far into the Caucasus, a measure which Hitler, in turn, would not countenance. We were just as unsuccessful in our attempts to get an Army Group A regiment to relieve 16 Motorized Division at Yalista, where it was covering the deep flank of 1st Panzer Army. By the time anything was done about this, it was too late to make any difference at Stalingrad. The second possible way of reinforcing 4th Panzer Army in time for its thrust to Stalingrad lay in the provision of new forces by OKH. At the time in question, 17 Panzer Division and the newly established 306 Infantry Division were, in that order, on their way to Don Army Group. In consequence of the delay involved in assembling 57 Panzer Corps at Kotelnikovo, the former of the two could have arrived just in time to move off with it to Stalingrad. Unfortunately, OKH had the division detrained as its own reserve behind the left wing of the army group, because, not without reason, it feared a large-scale attack was impending there. Yet OKH could not have it both ways. Success for 4th Panzer Army and security against a crisis which, if it did arise, 17 Panzer Division could not master anyway. While we preferred success for 4th Panzer Army, Hitler opted for the security he hoped to achieve by his retention of 17 Panzer Division. The upshot was that when Hitler did release the division after 306 Infantry Division had caught up, it arrived too late for the first phase of the relief operation. Possibly, this was where the decisive opportunity was thrown away. To enhance the effect of my telephone calls on Zeitzler, and also to strengthen his hand in the daily battles he had to fight, I felt obliged to have frequent appreciations of the situation teleprinted through to him, or even direct to Hitler. One of these appreciations, that of 9th December 1942, is given in Appendix 2 to show what pains we took to keep Hitler and OKH in the picture at all times. It also affords impressive evidence of the numerical preponderance confronting the army group and shows the type of forces with which, except for the few newly arrived divisions, it had to conduct the battles outside the Stalingrad pocket. Last but not least, It demonstrates how the army group strove to bring home the gist of all operational problems to the Supreme Command. For the benefit of critical readers, 2 comments on this appreciation might be interpolated here. Some people may object to our having included any reference whatever to ways and means of continuing the battle in the event of 6th Armies being kept at Stalingrad after a corridor had been cut through to it. The answer to this is that it would have been quite pointless to try to convince a man like Hitler of the futility of leaving an army in the city, even assuming that supply by such a corridor were possible. Only by indicating the reinforcement problems which would beset him if he attempted to retain his hold on the city could one hope to make him see the need to disengage 6th Army. Unfortunately, even this appeal to reason failed to shake his obstinacy where prestige was concerned. At the time, however, we still cherished the hope that Hitler would bow to the inevitable when it came to the point. Secondly, it may seem surprising, in view of the number of enemy formations confronting the army group, that we still continued to believe in the possibility of relieving 6th Army at all. We might well be reproached with having underrated our opponent. The crux of the matter, as far as we were concerned, however, was that the maximum risk had to be accepted if we were to bring our comrades of 6th Army a chance of salvation. Events have shown that we came near enough to opening their way to freedom. The fact that we were fated to fail in the end was due to causes which I shall discuss in due course. We and the enemy now set off on a race for life or death. Our own goal was to save the life of 6th Army, but to do so we staked the very existence not only of Don Army Group, but also of Army Group A. It was a race to decide whether the relief group of 4th Panzer Army would manage to join hands with 6th Army east of the Don, before the enemy forced us to break off the operation. This he might achieve by overrunning our weak front on the Cheer or the left wing of the Army Group, and possibly the right wing of Army Group B as well, and putting himself in a position to cut all the rear communications of Don Army Group and Army Group A. To mount and maintain an assault operation east of the Don, while the danger outlined above grew increasingly acute from one day to the next, meant incurring a risk that can seldom have been run before. I cannot believe that Hitler realized its full import at the time. Otherwise, he would almost certainly have taken more radical measures, at least to the extent of reinforcing 4th Panzer Army for a speedy relief of Stalingrad. Instead, as General Zeitzler himself expressed it, he did nothing but put spokes in our wheel. 2 examples of this were his retention of 17 Panzer Division in the wrong spot throughout the crucial phase of the operation, and his failure to release 16 motorized division until it was too late. Many times Hitler declared that generals and general staff officers could only compute and would not take chances. There can hardly be any more striking rebuttal of his claim than the risk run by Don Army Group when it ordered 4th Panzer Army's drive on Stalingrad, and kept this going till the last possible moment in a situation which threatened to destroy the whole southern wing of the German armies. This race with death, which began on 12th of December when 4th Panzer Army struck out for Stalingrad, can only be sketched in broad outline here, as it is not possible to depict the lightning changes of situation which occurred in 57 Panzer Corps battles against an enemy who never ceased to throw in fresh forces. Tanks, first and foremost. The versatility of our armour and the superiority of our tank crews were brilliantly demonstrated in this period, as were the bravery of the Panzer Grenadiers and the skill of our anti-tank units. At the same time, it was seen what an experienced old armoured division like 6 Panzer could achieve under its admirable commander General Rauss and the tank specialist Colonel Verser-Hunersdorf, who, I am sorry to say, was later to be killed at the head of this same division, when it went into action with its full complement of armoured vehicles and assault guns. How hard, in contrast, was the lot of 23 Panzer Division, commanded by General Verser-Voormann, a former colleague of mine in the OKH operations branch who had been 5 times wounded in World War I, which had a bare 20 tanks to work with. Let us now try to follow at least those features of the battle that were material to its outcome. While 57 Corps finished assembling east of the Don around Kotelnikovo, Strong enemy forces had again been attacking our front on the lower Cheer since 10th December. It was now clear that there could be no further question of releasing 48 Panzer Corps on this front for it to break out of the Cheer-Don bridgehead and cooperate with 57 Panzer Corps. This made it more urgent than ever that 57 Panzer Corps should get on the move. After smashing an enemy attempt to overrun it while it was still in the process of detraining and final assembly, the Corps was able to cross the start line on 12th December. Its flanks were covered against the Volga in the east by 7 Romanian corps, and up to the Don in the west by 6 Romanian corps. The attack evidently surprised the enemy, who did not appear to have expected it quite so soon, and initially the corps made good progress. Far from sticking to defensive tactics, however, the enemy hastened to bring up fresh forces from the Stalingrad area and counterattacked again and again in attempts to recapture ground already won by our tanks, or to surround small numbers of the latter with his own numerically superior armour. In spite of having wiped out one strong group after another, 57 Panzer Corps had still achieved nothing decisive by 17th December, the date on which 17 Panzer Division was at last able to intervene east of the Don. OKH had finally released it from its detraining area behind the left wing of the army group in response to demands from my headquarters. Before it could take a hand east of the river, however, the division still had to accomplish the long haul up to and across the Don Bridge at Potemkinskaya. While 57 Panzer Corps was striving for decisive results on the east bank of the river, the enemy redoubled his efforts to the west of it in order to bring about the collapse of the German front on the Cheer. Above all, he had obviously grasped the significance of the bridgehead we were holding in the angle of the Cheer and Don, together with the Don Bridge contained therein, for ever since 12th December these had been the constant target of massed Soviet attacks. On 14th December we were forced off the bridge and had to blow it up. By 15th December it was apparent that the battle on the lower Cheer front had only a few more days to run. At the very same time, however, a new danger loomed up in the large bend of the Don. On 15th December there were obvious signs of an enemy attack being prepared in front of the left wing of Don Army Group and the right wing of Army Group B, and the following day local attacks were launched. Initially, it was not entirely clear whether the enemy was following his frequent practice of feeling out the front prior to a decisive breakthrough, or whether he was seeking to prevent us from transferring any forces from this sector to the battlefield east of the Don. Then, however, our radio monitors identified a new army, 3rd Guards, which implied that a breakthrough with some such far-reaching objective as Rostov was impending. The army group could not afford a decisive battle on its left wing as long as it had to fight for the liberation of 6th Army east of the Don. It had to hold off here if it could. So that the responsible headquarters, Army Detachment Hollet, might find the necessary reserves for a delaying action, Army Group made it pull back onto a shorter front further to the rear, bearing in mind the need to preserve continuity with the right wing of Army Group B. December 18th proved a day of crisis of the first order. East of the Don, despite the arrival of 17 Panzer Division, 57 Panzer Corps had still not fought things to a point which offered any prospect of its being able to thrust swiftly into the vicinity of Stalingrad and create the conditions needed for 6th Army's breakout. On the contrary, it looked as though the Corps would be forced onto the defensive, since the enemy was continuing to throw forces in its path from the siege front round the city. On the lower Cheer, heavy fighting was still in progress, although the enemy had not so far succeeded in penetrating our front. On the left wing of the army group, on the other hand, a most serious crisis was taking shape, the enemy having begun a major attack against Army Detachment Hollet and the Italian Army forming the right wing of Army Group B. In the case of Army Detachment Hollet, the 2 Romanian corps proved unequal to the onslaught, and there was some doubt whether even the German divisions would attain their alternative position in any semblance of order after being abandoned wholesale by their allies. What made things worse still was that the enemy had been able to overrun the Italian army in the first assault, thereby tearing open the flank of Don Army Group. The same day the army group called on OKH to take immediate steps to initiate the breakout of 6th Army towards 4th Panzer Army. There was still a chance that once 17 Panzer Division had made its presence fully felt, 57 Panzer Corps could win further ground in the direction of the pocket. In other words, one could still hope for a favourable outcome of the struggle east of the Don. Yet how much earlier this could have been achieved if only 17 Panzer and 16 motorised divisions, of which the latter was still tied up at Yelista, could have been available for 4th Panzer Army's relief operation from the very outset. Notwithstanding our insistence on the urgent need for a decision that would allow 6th Army to break out of Stalingrad, Hitler declined to sanction this, although his Chief of Staff had simultaneously to inform us that all forces still in the process of moving up were being directed to Army Group B on account of the plight of the Italian army. The fact that we were asked in this same connection whether Stalingrad could still be held showed what little idea the Supreme Command had, or was prepared to have, of the seriousness of the situation. Hitler's refusal to disengage the army from Stalingrad at this stage did not deter the army group from at least preparing for the inevitable. On 18th December, I sent my chief intelligence officer, Major Eismann, into the pocket to give 6th Army our views on the breakout operation, which would undoubtedly become necessary in the very near future. The following were the salient points of what he had to say. The critical situation on the Cheer front, and even more so on the Army Group's left wing, meant that 4th Panzer Army's battle to free 6th Army east of the Don could only continue for a limited period. Furthermore, it was doubtful whether the Panzer Army could maintain its drive right up to the actual siege front, because the enemy was constantly throwing in fresh forces from here to meet it. For this same reason, however, 6th Army's chances of breaking through the siege ring were at present better than they had ever been. A link-up between 4th Panzer and 6th Armies depended on the latter's taking an active part in the battle from now on. As soon as it set about breaking out of the pocket towards the southwest, the enemy would be unable to weaken his siege front any further, and this in turn would enable 4th Panzer Army to resume its advance towards the pocket. The task allotted to 6th Army in the orders for Winter Tempest, which it had received on 1st December, i.e. to hold itself in readiness to thrust southwest as far as the Donskaya Tsaritsa in order to make contact with 4th Panzer Army, would probably have to be extended. The army might now have to continue beyond the limited objective laid down for it in the Winter Tempest operation and keep pushing southwest until it actually joined the Panzer Army. While Winter Tempest laid down that 6th Army should still hold the Stalingrad area in accordance with Hitler's orders, the new alternative plan would mean evacuating it sector by sector in keeping with the progress of the breakthrough to the southwest. Major Eismann was also to point out that while the army group had made every possible effort in this direction, it did not believe the airlift could be improved far enough to allow 6th Army to hold out at Stalingrad for any length of time. The outcome of Major Eismann's mission, which had been intended to harmonise the views of the two headquarters, was not encouraging. Paulus himself had not been unimpressed by what Eismann told him, though he did not fail to emphasize the magnitude of the difficulties and risks which the task outlined to him would imply. The Army's Chief of Operations and Quartermaster General likewise stressed these difficulties to Major Eismann, but both men also declared that in the circumstances it was not only essential to attempt a breakout at the earliest possible moment, but also entirely feasible. What ultimately decided the attitude of 6th Army headquarters was the opinion of the Chief of Staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt. He contended that it was quite impossible for the army to break out just then, and that such a solution would be an acknowledgement of disaster. 6th Army, he told Eismann, will still be in position at Easter. All you people have to do is to supply it better. Schmidt obviously assumed that it was the business of the Supreme Command or Army Group to get the army out of a situation in which it had landed through no fault of our own, and to keep it adequately supplied from the air in the meantime. It was an understandable point of view, and one which in theory he had every right to hold. Unfortunately, circumstances had proved stronger. Eismann pointed out that although the Army Group was doing everything in its power to maintain supplies, It was not to blame when the weather brought the airlift to a virtual standstill, nor was it in a position to produce transport machines out of a hat. But all his remonstrances were like water off a duck's back as far as Schmidt was concerned. Even when Eisman sought to show that a breakout by Sixth Army was necessary in the interest of operations as a whole, the Chief of Staff still would not budge. While the Army commander was probably a better trained tactician and a clearer thinker, it looked as if his Chief of Staff was the stronger personality of the two. Disastrous though Schmidt's obstinacy was in this particular case, the same quality did him great credit in captivity later on. Judging by all that one has heard, he gave an admirable account of himself as a soldier and comrade, getting himself sentenced to 25 years forced labour in the process. Justice compels us to pay tribute to his behaviour. Author. And so the upshot of the talks was that General Paulus himself ended by pronouncing the breakout a sheer impossibility, and pointing out that the surrender of Stalingrad was forbidden by order of the Führer. While Major Eisman's mission had certainly made Sixth Army headquarters fully aware of the situation and the Army Group's intentions, it had still not achieved any identity of views on the task intended for Sixth Army. Could we expect an Army headquarters staff to execute an extremely difficult operation successfully when the Army commander and his Chief of Staff harboured doubts as to its feasibility? At any other time, such a divergence of opinions would have been regarded as grounds for requesting a change in the Army command. In the present critical situation, however, there could be no justification for such action. Any successor to the commander or the Chief of Staff would have needed time to play himself in, and when every day was vital, this just could not be spared. In any case, it would have been hopeless to try to obtain Hitler's approval for such a change, since it would have affected the very men who recommended holding out at Stalingrad. In spite of everything, Don Army Group was not willing to let slip the one remaining chance of saving Sixth Army, no matter how many difficulties and dangers the undertaking were to involve. It would entail issuing a formal order freeing the Army commander of all responsibility for both the hazard of a breakout and the abandonment of Stalingrad. This was a step we were fully prepared to take. The reasons why this order was not ultimately implemented by Sixth Army will be discussed later in their proper context. They were the subject of numerous conversations which Paulus and I and our respective Chiefs of Staff conducted on a newly established ultra-high-frequency wavelength, as well as of discussions between my own headquarters and the Supreme Command. The next day, 19th December, encouraged us to hope that the situation east of the Don would shortly reach a stage where the projected cooperation of the two armies might lead to the successful extrication of the one now at Stalingrad. On this particular day, 57 Panzer Corps scored a gratifying success. It managed to cross the Aksai River and thrust northwards as far as the Mishkova, its spearhead actually coming within 30 miles of the southern siege front. The moment for which we had longed since the takeover, when the approach of relief forces would offer Sixth Army its chance to break free, had arrived. If Sixth Army now began its breakout while 4th Panzer Army either continued to attack northwards or at least drew off further forces from the siege front, the enemy in between would find himself between two fires, and there would at least be a prospect of establishing enough contact to provide Sixth Army with the fuel, ammunition and food it needed for continuing its breakthrough. For this purpose, the Army Group had assembled transport columns loaded with 3,000 tons of supplies behind 4th Panzer Army, in addition to tractors for mobilizing part of the 6th Army artillery. They were all to be rushed through to the beleaguered army as soon as the tanks had cleared a route, however temporary. The situation on the Army Group's front west of the Don on 19th December likewise indicated that the troops there should be able, at least for as long as 6th Army needed to fight a way through to the southwest, to stall off any decisive developments compelling us to break off the operation east of the river. Meanwhile, our front on the lower Chir was still holding. Although the Army Group found it necessary to intervene with Army Detachment Hollet to safeguard the latter's withdrawal operation, there was every prospect that its alternative positions would be occupied as planned. On the other hand, the threat to the Army Detachment's open left flank was still present. The race with death on either side of the Don had entered its final and decisive phase. Would the army group succeed in preserving the situation in the large bend of the Don for a few days longer, until 6th Army had availed itself of what was undoubtedly its last opportunity? Certainly it could only do so if not a single hour were wasted. At noon on 19th December, therefore, the Army Group sent the Supreme Command an urgent appeal by teleprinter to let 6th Army finally disengage from Stalingrad and drive southwest to join 4th Panzer Army. See Appendix 3, Author. When this message too failed to evoke any immediate response, an order was issued to 4th Panzer and 6th Armies at 1800 hours, in which the latter was directed to commence breaking through to the southwest forthwith. See Appendix 4 to Author. The first phase of the operation was to be the winter tempest attack detailed on 1st December. It would, if necessary, continue beyond the Donskaya Tsaritsa for the purpose of making contact with 4th Panzer Army and enabling the supply convoy to pass through. At the same time, the order envisaged a second phase of the breakthrough which would, if need be, follow directly on the winter tempest attack. On receipt of the code word Thunderclap, 6th Army was to proceed with its advance towards 4th Panzer Army and simultaneously begin to evacuate the Stalingrad area sector by sector. The reservation imposed on the issue of this code word arose from the need to synchronize the assault operations of both armies, as well as from the question as to whether it would be possible to coordinate the passage of the transport convoy with these operations. Above all, the Army Group had to try to persuade Hitler to rescind his order to 6th Army to hold Stalingrad at all costs, for although the responsibility for not complying with it would rest with the Army Group as soon as it gave the signal for Thunderclap, the commander of 6th Army would still feel his hands were tied as long as it remained in force. If there had ever been a chance to save 6th Army since the end of November, when Hitler refused Paulus permission for an immediate breakout before the enemy had consolidated his siege ring round Stalingrad, that chance came on 19th December. The Army Group had given the order to take it in spite of the difficulties 6th Army's breakthrough might entail, and the perilous situation that had meanwhile developed on the rest of the Army Group's front. The risk we were running in the latter respect will be discussed in due course. The immediate problem, that is, from 19th till 25th December, was whether 6th Army would actually be able and willing to carry out the order issued to it. Hitler did in fact agree to the armies attacking in a southwesterly direction for the purpose of joining up with 4th Panzer Army. Yet he continued to insist that it should hold its northern, eastern and western fronts around the city. He was still hoping that it would be possible to cut open a corridor through which the army at Stalingrad could be supplied on a really long-term basis. There were two very obvious objections to this. First, the situation of the Army Group as a whole, particularly with regard to developments in the neighbouring area of Army Group B, no longer allowed two armies, 6th and 4th Panzer, to be tied down east of the Don. By this time, not only the fate of 6th Army was at stake, but also that of Don Army Group and Army Group A, both of which, if the enemy took resolute action, were liable to be cut off from their communication zones. Secondly, it was a sheer impossibility for 6th Army to mobilise all its remaining offensive power for a breakthrough to the southwest and still hold its present fronts around Stalingrad. It might conceivably be able to do so for 1 or 2 days longer, until such time as the enemy had grasped its intentions, but there could never be any question of its making a long stand in the city and simultaneously maintaining a link with 4th Panzer Army. While Hitler's reasons for opposing the execution of the plan laid down in the Army Group order of 19th December were unrealistic, the objections raised by 6th Army headquarters were not of a kind that could be dismissed out of hand. They showed how great were the risks which must necessarily be incurred if the Army Group order were carried out. When the army declared that it could not undertake the breakout as long as Hitler insisted on the retention of Stalingrad, it was perfectly right. That was why the Army Group had explicitly ordered the evacuation of the fortified area on receipt of Thunderclap. However, the army commander still had to decide whom to obey, Hitler or the commander of the Army Group. Furthermore, the army thought it would need 6 days to prepare for the breakout. In our own view, the estimate was much too high and unacceptable in the present situation, even if due allowance were made for all the difficulties facing the army in consequence of its great loss of mobility. To wait 6 days more seemed impossible to us, if only because of the situation on the army group's left wing. Most of all, the enemy forming the siege front around the city was not going to sit doing nothing for all that time, while the breakout preparations went on under his very nose. It might perhaps be possible to conceal these preparations, and the consequent thinning out of Sixth Army's other fronts for a limited period. But if the assembly of forces for the breakthrough on the southwestern front were going to take 6 whole days, the enemy would already have started attacking on the other fronts before the breakthrough gained momentum. This must be avoided at all costs. The army also doubted its ability even to disengage the forces earmarked for the breakthrough from their present fronts, as the latter were already being subjected to local attack. Here, too, speed would be all-important. Provided that the army started its breakout in good time, it would be spared the trouble of combating any enemy incursions on its other fronts and need merely fight delaying actions to cover a step-by-step withdrawal. The army rightly emphasized in the teleprinter conversations between General Paulus and myself and our respective chiefs of staff that the code word thunderclap must follow immediately upon winter tempest, and that it would not be possible to pause, for example, on the Donskaya Tsaritsa. This was a point on which we were completely unanimous, the army group order having in fact already foreshadowed that thunderclap would be linked directly to winter tempest. What undoubtedly weighed heavily with the commander of Sixth Army was the fact that the general debility of the troops and the reduced mobility of units following the slaughtering of horses for food made it most unlikely that such a difficult and risky undertaking, particularly when carried out under conditions of extreme cold, could possibly succeed. It was the fuel position, however, which finally decided Sixth Army against attempting to break out and persuaded the army group that it could not insist on its order being implemented. General Paulus reported that he had only enough petrol to take his tanks, of which about 100 must still have been serviceable, a maximum distance of 20 miles. This meant that he could not move off until either an adequate supply of fuel and rations were guaranteed or 4th Panzer Army had advanced to within 20 miles of the enemy siege front. Now no one could dispute the inability of Sixth Army's tanks, which represented its essential offensive power, to bridge a gap of some 30 miles with fuel stocks that were only sufficient for 20. On the other hand, one could not possibly wait until the army's fuel stocks were brought up to the level it demanded, 4,000 tons, quite apart from the fact that we were aware from practical experience of the utter impossibility of lifting such quantities by air. Any such delay would have meant wasting the time that could still be spared for the army's breakthrough. One had to be prepared to live from hand to mouth and to go into action with what one had, including, of course, the quantities of fuel which could be flown in during the next few days, while the army was still assembling. Beyond that, one could only hope that stocks could be constantly replenished from the air in the course of the breakthrough. A point worth remembering here is that troops always have more fuel in hand than they care to admit in official returns. But even if this were not taken into account, one could still hope that things would develop on the following lines. The moment Sixth Army launched its attack towards the southwest, things would become easier for 4th Panzer Army, for henceforth the enemy would no longer be able to keep throwing out fresh forces from the Stalingrad siege front to meet it. 4th Panzer Army, whose further progress over the Mishkova was by no means a certainty on 19th December, would doubtless be able to accomplish the outstanding 12 miles once the pressure were relieved by the action of 6th Army. It was obviously risky to include this in our calculations, but without it we simply could not expect to save 6th Army. But the really crucial reason why this fuel question was ultimately decisive in bringing about the retention of 6th Army at Stalingrad lay in the fact that Hitler had a liaison officer in the pocket. By this means, he learnt of Paulus's contention that the fuel situation made it impossible for him not only to launch a breakthrough operation, but even to move up to the start line. I spent some considerable time on the telephone trying to make Hitler allow Sixth Army to break out and abandon Stalingrad. "I fail to see what you are driving at," was all he would say. "Paulus has only enough petrol for 15 to 20 miles at the most. He says himself that he can't break out at present." And so the army group had to contend on one hand with the Supreme Command, which made any attack by Sixth Army to the southwest dependent on its simultaneous retention of the remaining Stalingrad fronts, and on the other with the command staff of Sixth Army, which declared that the fuel situation rendered it incapable of complying with the army group order. In support of his decision, Hitler was able to invoke the army commander who would be called upon to tackle this difficult task. Had he not had this pretext to hand, he might still have been forced by the pressure of events to give up his demand that the city continue to be held even when the breakthrough was in progress. But then, in all probability, General Paulus would likewise have seen the whole problem with different eyes, since he would no longer have been acting against an express order from Hitler. The fact that I have dealt in such detail with the Sixth Army commander's motives in not seizing the last opportunity to save his army is due to my belief that I owe this to him irrespective of anything connected with his personal character or subsequent conduct. As I have already stated, none of the reasons he advanced for his decision could be turned down as inadmissible. Yet the fact remained that this was our one and only chance of saving the army. Not to utilize it, however great the risks, meant to resign all hope of salvation. To take it implied staking everything on one card. In the view of the army group, this was now imperative. It is easy to criticize the attitude of the future Field Marshal Paulus in those vital days. Certainly there was more to it than mere blind obedience to Hitler, for there can be no question that Paulus had grave conscientious doubts as to whether he should mount an operation which must inevitably lead, in direct contravention of the wish clearly expressed by Hitler, to the surrender of Stalingrad to the enemy. In the same connection, however, it should be noted that when it occurred as the result of overwhelming enemy pressure, even this surrender would have been justifiable in relation to Hitler's order, and that since the army group had ordered the evacuation, it was the latter's own responsibility. Apart from this conflict of conscience, however, the army commander was faced with a tremendous gamble if he obeyed the army group order. While a breakout certainly offered the army a chance of rescue, it could equally well lead to its destruction. Should the first attempt to break through the enemy's siege front prove unsuccessful, should Sixth Army get stuck halfway while Fourth Panzer Army were unable to make any further progress, or should the enemy manage to overrun the German troops shielding the breakout from the rear and flanks, then Sixth Army's fate would be sealed in no time at all. The task confronting it was an incredibly formidable one and hazardous in the extreme. Like a square fighting in all four directions at once, it had to move out to meet Fourth Panzer Army under the constant threat of being fought to a standstill in its attack to the southwest, or alternatively of having its rearguard and flank protection overrun. Furthermore, this task would have had to be performed with troops already worn down by hunger and greatly restricted in their mobility. It is not unlikely, however, that the hope of regaining their freedom and eluding death or captivity would have helped them to accomplish an apparent impossibility. When General Paulus let the last opportunity slip, when he hesitated and finally decided against the venture, he certainly did so on account of the responsibility he felt on his own shoulders. Although the army group strove by its order to absolve him of that responsibility, he still felt unable to acquit himself of it, either vis-à-vis Hitler or before his own conscience. In the week that followed the army group's order for an immediate breakout, the fate of Sixth Army was decided. For 6 whole days, the army group ran every conceivable risk in order to leave the door open to Sixth Army to fight its way back to freedom in conjunction with Fourth Panzer Army. Throughout this period, the army group was constantly threatened by the danger that the enemy, resolutely exploiting his breakthrough in the area of the Italian army, would either drive across the open Donetsk crossings to Rostov, where he could strike at the lifeline of our whole southern wing, or else that he would wheel round into the rear of the left wing of Don Army Group, Army Detachment Hollet. We had to see the attempt through even at the risk that the thin protective screen serving us as a front on the lower Cheer, 3rd Romanian Army, and in the area of Army Detachment Hollet might finally disintegrate. In spite of everything, the Army Group left 4th Panzer Army in its exposed position east of the Don as long as it was possible to hope that 6th Army would avail itself of its last opportunity of escape. The time limit was reached when developments on the left wing of the Army Group left us no choice but to throw forces in there from the eastern bank of the Don, and when, on 25th of December, the position of 57 Panzer Corps on the Mishkova became untenable. Let us now briefly survey the dramatic events of that week. It all began on the left wing of the Army Group, or more precisely on the left flank of Army Detachment Hollet. Exactly what happened to the Italians was not known. It seemed that only one light division and one or another of the infantry divisions had put up any resistance worth mentioning. Be that as it may, on the morning of 20th December, the German general commanding the corps on the Italians' right wing came in to state that the 2 Italian divisions under his command were at that moment beating a rapid retreat, evidently because of a report that there were already 2 enemy armoured corps deep in their flank. As a result, the flank of Army Detachment Hollet was completely exposed. When the Army Group headquarters was informed of this situation by General Hollet, who actually came under Army Group B, it directed him to use every means at his disposal to halt the Italian divisions. The army detachment under his command received orders to hold its position on the upper Cheer and to cover its left flank by an echeloned defence. In the course of the day, however, the army detachment's own flimsy front was penetrated in 2 places. 7. Romanian Division carried out an unauthorised withdrawal, and HQ-1 Romanian Corps abandoned its command post in a panic. By the evening of 20th of December, the situation in Army Detachment Hollet's deep flank was utterly obscure. No one could tell whether the Italians who had been in action next to it were still offering any resistance, and if so, where. The enemy's armoured spearheads were reported everywhere in the rear of Army Detachment Hollet, even as far back as the important Donets crossing of Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. During the next 2 days, the position of Army Detachment Hollet became increasingly acute. With even its front penetrated, it presented a no longer protectable flank and rear to the enemy armour, which now enjoyed a completely free hand in the sector where the Italians had been overrun. Before long, this perilous situation was bound to have its effect on the 3rd Romanian Army front on the lower Cheer. Army Detachment Hollet first had to do its best to establish a new front roughly level with that of 3rd Romanian Army, in order to cover both the latter's flank and the Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya airfields that were so indispensable to the Stalingrad airlift. Everything possible also had to be done to keep the important Donets crossings of Forchstadt and Kamensk-Shakhtinsky open. That such temporary expedients could contain the situation on the Army Group's left wing for at most 2 or 3 days longer was only too evident. As early as 20th December, the Army Group had sent OKH a teleprinter message stating point blank that if the enemy acted decisively following his breakthrough on the Italian front, he would bear down on Rostov and seek a major decision against Don Army Group and Army Group A. It was characteristic of the state of affairs prevailing at the Supreme Command that even the Chief of Staff of the German Army was unable to take this message into Hitler on that particular day, because the latter, with only OKW representatives in attendance, was busy negotiating with an Italian delegation. The only reply we got was an OKH directive received on 22nd December, assigning Army Detachment Hollet a defence line which had long been overtaken by events. On the very same day, it was actually touch and go whether the German and a handful of Romanian formations which the Army Detachment had fighting out in front would ever get back to form a new line at all. Clearly, the Army Group could not expect any effective measures from the Supreme Command to stabilise the position in the gap torn in our front with Army Group B by the Italian debacle. It had even refused to allow the quick transfer of an infantry division from Army Group A to ensure the immediate protection of Rostov. All we could do, therefore, was to draw on our own resources, a decision rendered particularly painful by the fact that it could only be carried out at the expense of the Army Group's right wing, i.e. the forces now in action east of the Don. Yet there was no room for any delay, for on 24th December the crisis at Army Detachment Hollet reached its climax. 3 enemy tank and mechanised corps had driven through the breach in the front where the Italians and 3 Romanian division had been. 2 of them, 25 tank and 50 mechanised corps, were already approaching the vital airlift bases at Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya, while the 3rd, 8 tank corps, was round behind those elements of the army detachment which were still fighting on either the middle or upper reaches of the Shire. While the situation on the left wing of the army group, particularly on its open western flank, became increasingly grave, we continued to strive for the breakout of 6th Army, which still depended on Hitler's renunciation of Stalingrad and on the army's readiness to take the plunge. 4th Panzer Army was meanwhile doing everything in its power to accomplish the last lap to Stalingrad, hoping at the same time that 6th Army would make its task easier by starting to attack to the southwest. In the days following its arrival at the Mishkova on 19th December, the relieving army had become embroiled in heavy fighting against the never-ending waves of forces thrown in by the enemy from Stalingrad to halt its advance. Despite this, 57 Panzer Corps had succeeded in gaining a foothold on the north bank of the river and, after a series of ding-dong engagements, in forming a bridgehead there. Mass attacks by the enemy brought him nothing but bloody losses. Already, on the distant horizon, the leading troops of the corps could see the reflection of the gunfire around Stalingrad. Success seemed to be within striking distance if only 6th Army would create a diversion by going over to the attack and at least prevent the enemy from constantly throwing fresh forces in the path of 4th Panzer Army. For reasons which have already been stated, however, 6th Army's attack never materialised. On the afternoon of 23rd December, the Army Group was regretfully compelled to take account of the situation on the left wing, which was more than critical by this time, by shifting forces to that area. 3rd Romanian Army on the Lower Chir was directed to release HQ, 48 Panzer Corps, and 11 Panzer Division to restore the position on the Army Group's western wing, and to make good this loss, 4th Panzer Army had to give up 1 armoured division, without which the Lower Chir front could not possibly be held. The very next day showed how imperative this measure had been. Tatsinskaya airfield was lost, and with it went a means of supplying 6th Army by air. It could not be recaptured until 28th December. The Army Group had only taken this agonizing decision to deprive the 4th Panzer Army Relief Group of a whole division when it became clear that 6th Army could no longer be expected to break out in time. Even now it could have put off doing so if only 16 motorised division had been already available. On 20th December, admittedly, OKH had yielded to the promptings of my own headquarters and finally given orders for this division to be relieved at Yelista by the Viking Division from Army Group B, but unfortunately the process was to take 10 days to complete. As it happened, 10 days was the exact period which had elapsed since the Army Group's first request for 16 motorised divisions' release. Had approval been given forthwith, the division could have been immediately available for action on the Chir front on 23rd December, and 57th Panzer Corps need never have been deprived of an armoured division. As was so often the case, the decision bore the stamp of Hitler's dilatoriness. Although Hitler now promised to let the Army Group have 7 Panzer Division, it was bound to arrive too late for the relief operation already in progress. At the same time, he hoped to see events take a turn for the better now that the 1st Battalion of Tigers was due to arrive. But this was to prove equally fallacious. Apart from the fact that some considerable time was to pass before the Tigers showed up, they had never been tested under active service conditions and were afflicted with so many growing pains that they could not initially render any worthwhile assistance. This, incidentally, was typical of the way Hitler overrated the power of new weapons. And so, in the battleground east of the Don, too, the hour now came for the initiative to pass to our opponents. On 27th December 57th, Panzer Corps was attacked in the Mishkova sector, where a steady enemy build-up had been going on, and was pushed back to the Aksai. It became clear in the next few days that the Soviet intention was to envelop the Corps from the east and west. Two Soviet armies, 51st and 2nd Guards, comprising 3 mechanized, 1 tank, 3 rifle, and 1 cavalry corps, were identified on the northern and eastern fronts of 4th Panzer Army. A large proportion of these forces had been drawn from the Stalingrad siege front, though reinforcements had also come from over the Volga. Within a day or two, the enormous preponderance of forces now amassed by the enemy compelled 4th Panzer Army to withdraw as far as Kotelnikovo, whence it had originally begun to drive to Stalingrad on 12th December. What rendered this withdrawal quite inevitable was the inability of the 4th Romanian Army units under command to rise to the task of giving flank protection to the troops of 57 Panzer Corps in their hard battle on the Aksai. The troops of both 7 Romanian Corps, which was to have held the army's eastern flank towards the Volga, and of 6 Romanian Corps, which was meant to safeguard the ground between 57 Panzer Corps and the Don, had lost all will to fight, due in part, no doubt, to the scant efforts of either of the command staffs to maintain morale. For all his assurances that he was doing everything possible to rally his troops to fresh resistance, the commander of 4th Romanian Army proved powerless in the face of such disintegration. We were left with no choice but to pull these units out of the line and send them home to Romania. The attempt to relieve 6th Army undertaken on 12th of December had failed, at least for the time being. Could there, judging by the way things had developed since, be any hope of renewing it? Today, with one's retrospective knowledge of the turn events took in the area of Army Group B, the reply to this question must be in the negative. At the time, though, it could not be foreseen that the catastrophe suffered by the Italian army would be followed, before January was out, by an even greater one in the Hungarian army's sector on the Don. And so, despite all the objections which existed, the Army Group still did not feel able to abandon its policy of getting help through to 6th Army. With this in mind, it submitted the following proposals to OKH on 16th of December. In order to maintain the position on the left wing of the Army Group, where the enemy was threatening to break through towards Rostov, for at least a limited period, we called for the earliest possible intervention of an army-sized battle group, Armygruppe, which OKH had already begun assembling in the Milerovo area, just behind the right wing of Army Group B. In addition, we wanted an infantry division of Army Group A's 17th Army moved quickly over to Rostov, for the purpose of affording it direct protection. Likewise, 7 Panzer Division, which had provisionally been promised to the Army Group and would be arriving too late to be committed east of the Don, must now take a hand in the battle on the left wing of the Army Group. The worst that need be expected in the centre of the Army Group front was a withdrawal to the Donetsk line. Besides, the situation on the lower Chir had relaxed somewhat in the last few days, as the enemy had obviously concentrated his forces further west to capture our airfields at Tatsinskaya and Morosovsky. I have also to report that only 70 tons were flown in today. Some of the Corps will exhaust bread supplies tomorrow, fats this evening, evening fare tomorrow. Radical measures now urgent. The contents of this message confirmed how wrong Paulus's Chief of Staff had been only a week before, when he asserted that the army could hold out till Easter if properly supplied. The message also showed that when the Army Group had ordered 6th Army to break out of the pocket 1 week previously, this, in view of the approach of 4th Panzer Army, had not only been its first chance of being rescued, but, as could be seen from the state the army was in, its last one too. Otherwise, except for local attacks, there was relative calm on the 6th Army fronts around the end of December and beginning of January. This was either because the enemy wished to munition his artillery for a grand assault, or because he was putting all the forces he could spare into an attempt to destroy 4th Panzer Army and to score the success he was after in the large bend of the Don. On 8th January, General Huber appeared at Army Group headquarters on his way back from seeing Hitler. The latter had had Huber flown out of Stalingrad to Lutzen to brief him on the situation of 6th Army. Huber told me that he had given Hitler a completely unvarnished picture of things in the pocket. This cannot, in fact, have differed in any respect from the one already available to Hitler from the Army Group's daily situation reports, but presumably he was not prepared to credit our own version without further evidence. Nevertheless, it was remarkable how Huber's stay in Lutzen had impressed him, and to what extent he had been influenced by Hitler's display of confidence, genuine or otherwise. Hitler had declared that everything would be done to supply 6th Army for a long time to come, and had drawn attention to the plan for its relief at a later date. With his confidence thus restored, Hube returned into the pocket, only to be flown out again on instructions from Hitler to take over the running of the airlift from outside. Not even he was able to improve it, however, its low efficiency being due to the prevailing weather and the inadequate resources of the Luftwaffe, and not to any shortcomings in the actual organisation. One statement of Huber's which touched me personally concerned a rumour circulating in 6th Army that I had sent them the signal, "Hang on, I'll get you out, Manstein." While I left no stone unturned to extricate 6th Army from Stalingrad, it has never been my custom to promise the troops anything which I was not certain of fulfilling and did not rest with me alone. General Hube, who was a fearless man, had tried to bring home to Hitler how damaging such events as the encirclement of 6th Army must be to his prestige as head of state. By this means he wished to suggest that Hitler should hand over command, at least on the Eastern Front, to a soldier. In view of the fact that Huber had called in to see us on his way to Lutzen, Hitler doubtless supposed that Huber's démarche had been inspired by me. This was in fact not the case. When, after the fall of Stalingrad, I myself proposed a change in the supreme military command to Hitler, he was already forewarned and flatly refused to consider such a thing. Otherwise, especially as he was then still under the impression of his responsibility for the loss of 6th Army, he might have proved more receptive to my ideas. On 9th January, the enemy called upon 6th Army to capitulate. On Hitler's orders, the demand was rejected. I do not think I can be reproached with ever having taken an uncritical view of Hitler's decisions or actions in the military sphere, yet I entirely support the decision he made in this instance, for however harsh it may have been from the humanitarian point of view, it was still necessary at the time. I do not propose to deal here with the purely soldierly viewpoint that no army may capitulate as long as it still has any strength left to fight. To abandon it would mean the very end of soldiering. Until we reach the happy era when states can do without armed might and soldiers no longer exist, this conception of soldierly honour will have to be maintained. Even the apparent hopelessness of a battle that can be avoided by capitulation does not in itself justify a surrender. If every commander-in-chief were to capitulate as soon as he considered his position hopeless, no one would ever win a war. Even in situations apparently quite bereft of hope, it has often been possible to find a way out in the end. From General Paulus's point of view, at all events, it was his soldierly duty to refuse to capitulate. An exception could only have been made if the army had had no further role to play and could serve no useful purpose in prolonging its struggle. And this in turn brings us to the crucial point, which justifies Hitler's order to refuse to capitulate and also barred the army group from intervening in favour of such action at that particular time. No matter how futile 6th Army's continued resistance might be in the long run, it still had, as long as it could conceivably go on fighting, a decisive role to fulfill in the overall strategic situation. It had to try to tie down the enemy forces opposing it for the longest possible space of time. At the beginning of December, an approximate total of 60 enemy formations, i.e. rifle divisions, armoured and mechanised brigades, etc., had been identified in the siege ring around the army. Some of them had doubtless been temporarily drawn off by the attack of 4th Panzer Army, but new ones had been brought up to replace them. By 19th January, 90 of the 259 formations reported to be facing Don Army Group were committed around 6th Army. What would have happened if the bulk of these 90 formations had been released through a capitulation of 6th Army on 9th of January is plain enough in the light of what has already been said about the Army Group's position and the consequent threat to the southern wing as a whole. The army was still capable of fighting, even though this was ultimately futile from its own point of view. Yet its ability to hold out was of decisive importance for the situation on the southern wing. Every extra day 6th Army could continue to tie down the enemy forces surrounding it was vital as far as the fate of the entire Eastern Front was concerned. It is idle to point out today that we still lost the war in the end, and that its early termination would have spared us infinite misery. That is merely being wise after the event. In those days it was by no means certain that Germany was bound to lose the war in the military sense. A military stalemate, which might in turn have led to a similar state of affairs in the political field, would have been entirely within the bounds of possibility if the situation on the southern wing of the German armies could in some way have been restored. This, however, depended first and foremost on 6th Army's continuing the struggle and holding down the enemy siege forces for as long as it possessed the slightest capacity to resist. It was the cruel necessity of war which compelled the Supreme Command to demand that one last sacrifice of the brave troops at Stalingrad. The fact that the self-same Supreme Command was responsible for the army's plight is beside the point in this context. Following 6th Army's refusal to capitulate on 9th January, the Soviet attack, preceded by intensive artillery preparation and supported by a large number of tanks, broke loose on all fronts. The main pressure was directed against the salient, which protruded furthest west by Marinovka, and the enemy was able to break in at several points. On 11th of January, the situation became even more critical, and because of the lack of ammunition and fuel, the army could no longer restore it to any appreciable extent. The loss of the positions in the Karpovka Valley, and in particular of the inhabited localities there, deprived the troops on the Western Front of what protection they had hitherto enjoyed against the cold. Furthermore, the state of the weather ruled out any hope of an airlift. This aggravation of 6th Army's plight was made clear in a special report of 12th January, which the Army Group immediately forwarded to OKH. Despite the troops' heroic resistance, the Army stated, the heavy fighting of the last few days has resulted in deep enemy penetrations, which could so far be contained only with difficulty. Reserves are no longer available, nor can any be formed. Heavy weapons now immobilized. Severe losses and inadequate supplies, together with cold, have also considerably reduced troops' powers of resistance. If enemy maintains attacks in present strength, fortress front unlikely to hold more than a few days longer. Resistance will then resolve itself into localized actions. On 12th of January, weather again stopped the airlift and also prevented the Luftwaffe from flying any sorties in support of the army's hard defensive battles. That evening, General Pickert, the man responsible for controlling the Luftwaffe's side of the airlift, came out of the pocket. He painted a shocking picture of the position and set a limit of 2 to 4 days on the army's capacity for continued resistance, an estimate that was to prove inaccurate by reason of the bravery and self-sacrifice of the troops. In Pickett's opinion, not even an improvement of the airlift could make much difference from now on, as the army's resources no longer sufficed to patch up the points where the enemy had broken in. The following information on the tactical situation inside the pocket emerged from a report brought out to us by Pickett from Paulus, who had meanwhile been promoted Colonel General. On the northwestern front, the enemy had attacked with a force of between 10 and 12 divisions. Parts of 3 and 29 motorized infantry divisions had been outflanked from the north and smashed, with the result that it no longer seemed possible to rebuild a defence line here. The 2 gallant divisions had knocked out 100 tanks between them, but the enemy still appeared to have 50 intact. On the southern front of the pocket, in spite of heroic resistance by 297 Infantry Division, the enemy had succeeded in breaking in after 2 days of intensive artillery bombardment. Here, too, there were no more forces available to close the gap. Of over 100 Soviet tanks taking part in this assault, 40 had been knocked out. The eastern front of the pocket was still holding at present, though here, too, heavy enemy pressure was being exerted. On the northeastern front, the enemy had penetrated deeply in several places. 16 panzer divisions' fighting strength was exhausted. Paulus further stated that the army would stand and fight to the last round. Any reduction in the size of the pocket, as now suggested by Hitler to General Hubie, at the time when it was vitally necessary to accumulate forces for the breakout, Hitler had issued an order expressly forbidding such action. Author would only serve to hasten the collapse, as no heavy weapons could now be moved. Since the airlift had been inadequate all along, no improvement could help matters now. The length of time the army could continue to resist depended entirely on the intensity of the enemy's attacks. That same day, the Pitomnik airfield was lost. Henceforth, the only one left to us in the Stalingrad pocket was that at Gumrak. During the night, however, Paulus reported that there might still be some prospect of continuing to defend the city if several battalions of troops were flown in forthwith with their full scale of weapons. He had already asked us repeatedly to fly in several thousand men to make good his losses, but the army group had been unable to comply because it possessed neither the necessary replacements nor indeed a single uncommitted battalion. Nor would it in any case have acceded to these requests from 6th Army once 4th Panzer Army's rescue drive had become bogged down, if only because there could be no justification for dispatching any reinforcements or replacements into the pocket from then on. It was already quite bad enough to have to fly unit commanders and general staff officers back into the pocket on their return from leave. But apart from the fact that the army urgently needed them, these officers, some of whom bore such old military names as Bismarck and Below, themselves insisted on returning to their troops, thereby proving that the tradition of self-denial and comradeship could withstand the hardest of tests. On 13th of January, Colonel General Paulus's senior aide, Captain Baer, an exemplary young officer who had already won the Knight's Cross, flew out to see us, bringing the army's war diary with him. He told us how bravely the troops were still fighting, and what fortitude all ranks had shown in coming to terms with the cruelty of their fate. Baer carried letters from Paulus and his chief of staff to Schultz and myself, letters reflecting the courage, integrity and decency that govern the German soldiers' way of thinking. They fully recognized that the army group had done everything humanly possible to get 6th Army out. On the other hand, of course, one detected their bitterness at the fact that the promises about air supplies had not been kept. All I can say to this is that neither Colonel General Verser Richthofen nor I had ever made such promises. The man responsible for them was Goering. On 16th of January there was again heavy fighting on all the army fronts. For a time it was impossible for any more aircraft to land, following the excessive losses inflicted by the enemy's ground and fighter defences earlier in the day. In the main, it was now only possible to fly supplies in at night or drop them from the air. Inevitably, a considerable volume of stores delivered by the latter method went astray. The same day, Hitler put Field Marshal Milch in charge of the airlift. On 17th January, the army radioed that the Gumrak airfield was usable again, but the Luftwaffe did not agree. The army group, however, insisted that an attempt be made to land there. On 19th of January, I had my first talk with Milch, who had been slightly injured the day before when the car in which he had been coming to see me collided with a railway engine. I impressed on him the urgent need for a radical improvement of the airlift, notwithstanding the hopelessness of 6th Army's position. Apart from the fact that we owed it to our comrades at Stalingrad to maintain their supplies until the very last hour, I said, the army was performing a vital operational task in continuing to tie down 90 Soviet formations. In view of the critical situation on the rest of the Army Group's front and its open flank by Army Group B, every extra day we could keep 6th Army in action might well be of decisive value. Milch promised to release all possible resources from the home front, including the last reserves of transport aircraft and technical personnel for maintenance and repair work. The latter were particularly important now, as the Morosovsky and Tatsinskaya airfields had by this time fallen into enemy hands, and the airlift was having to operate from Novocherkassk and Rostov, and bases even further to the rear. From what Milch told me, it was clear that if he had been called in several weeks earlier, he might have been able to ease matters considerably, since he had access to many resources back at home which were not available to Wiese Richthofen. This meant that Goering was all the more to blame for not having ensured that the resources in question were tapped at the right time. On 24th January, the following communication reached us from the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Zeitzler. The following radio message has been received here. Fortress can be held for only a few days longer. Troops exhausted and weapons immobilized as a result of non-arrival of supplies. Imminent loss of last airfield will reduce supplies to a minimum. No basis left on which to carry out mission to hold Stalingrad. Russians already able to pierce individual fronts, whole stretches of which are being lost through men dying. Heroism of officers and men nevertheless unbroken. In order to use this for final blow, shall give orders just before final break-up for all elements to fight through to southwest in organized groups. Some of these will get through and sow confusion behind Russian lines. Failure to move will mean end of everyone, as prisoners will also die of cold and hunger. Suggest flying out a few men, officers and other ranks as specialists for use in future operations. Appropriate order must be given soon, as landing facilities unlikely to exist much longer. Please detail officers by name, obviously excluding myself. Paulus. The following reply has been sent, message received, identical with recommendation put up by me 4 days ago. On my resubmission, Führer has directed 1. Re-breakout. Führer reserves right of final decision. Please send further signal in case. 2. Re-flying out of personnel. Führer has refused for time being. Please send Zitzewitz here to restate case. I shall take him to see Führer. Zeitzler. As regards Colonel General Paulus's request to have individual members of his army flown out, I would offer the following comment. Seen purely from the viewpoint of military expediency, it would naturally have been desirable to save the highest possible number of essential specialists. Always bearing in mind, of course, that they must be selected quite irrespective of rank. From the humanitarian point of view, it goes without saying that one should try to get every single man out. Yet there was also an aspect of soldierly ethics to consider, the one which dictated that the very first to be flown out should be the wounded. This, in fact, we did succeed in doing on a quite remarkable scale. The evacuation of specialists, however, could only have been achieved at the expense of leaving wounded men behind. Besides, the majority of specialists to be flown out would inevitably have been officers, for the simple reason that an officer's training renders him more important in war than the private soldier, unless the latter happens to have some very special qualification as a technician or scientist. But in a situation like Sixth Armies, the German military code demands that when lives are at stake, the officers must take second place to the men. It was for this reason that the army group made no move to get the Sixth Army commander's proposal accepted by Hitler. As for any attempt to break through the enemy lines in small groups at the last moment, Hitler's final decision never materialized. Nonetheless, the army group did try to create a basis of survival for successful groups of evaders by dropping food at various points behind the enemy front and sending out reconnaissance aircraft in search of them. But none reached the army group front, nor were any sighted by our pilots. At all events, Paulus's message shows that up to the very last those members of Sixth Army who still had any strength left did not lose their will to fight. Indeed, we were aware that some of the younger officers and men, whose resistance was not yet exhausted, were resolved whatever happened to try to fight their way through the enemy's siege ring when the time came. This was why we took the measures described above, fruitless though they proved. On 22nd January, the Russians reached the Gumrak airfield, with the result that supplies could no longer be delivered by landing aircraft. Having reported that he could no longer seal the gap in the front there and that his ammunition and rations were coming to an end, Paulus now sought Hitler's permission to begin surrender negotiations. In this connection, I had a long argument with the latter by telephone. I urged him to authorize a capitulation, my belief being that though every day's reduction of the army's resistance must aggravate the army group's situation as a whole, the time had now come to put an end to this valiant struggle. In bitter fighting, the army had expended its last ounce of strength to hold a far stronger enemy, thereby decisively contributing to the salvation of the Eastern Front that winter. From now on, the army's sufferings would bear no relation to any advantage which could be derived from continuing to tie down the enemy's forces. In a long and violent dispute, Hitler rejected the request made by Paulus and myself and ordered the army to fight on to the end. His grounds for doing so were that every day the enemy's Stalingrad divisions were prevented from being committed elsewhere represented a vital saving. Yet the situation was critical enough now that the Russians had also overrun the Hungarian army on the Don and virtually wiped Army Group B off the map. From Voroshilovgrad on the Donets up as far as Voronezh on the Don, there was a gaping void within which the enemy was advancing in strength and had almost complete freedom of movement. Whether, in this situation, Don Army Group and Army Group A, which was now withdrawing from the Caucasus, could be saved at all seemed more than doubtful. Hitler contended that even if Sixth Army were no longer able to form a coherent front, the fight could still be continued in smaller pockets for some time yet. Finally, he declared that capitulation was futile, as the Russians would never keep any agreements anyway. That the second prediction was correct in essence, if not in the strictly literal sense, is shown by the fact that of the 90,000 prisoners who finally fell into Soviet hands, not more than a few thousand can be alive today. It must be emphasized here, moreover, that the Soviets had intact railways running close up to Stalingrad, and that, given goodwill, it must have been possible for them to feed and evacuate the prisoners. Inevitable though the high loss of life from cold and exhaustion may well have been, the death rate in this case still appears quite excessive. When Hitler turned down my request for Sixth Army's capitulation, I was naturally faced with the personal problem of deciding whether to register my disagreement by resigning command of the army group. It was not the first time that I had contemplated doing so. The problem had particularly oppressed me during those Christmas days of 1942, when I had failed to persuade Hitler to let Sixth Army break out, and I was often to encounter it again in the months ahead. It is, I think, understandable that one should have wished to be released from responsibilities rendered almost unbearable by the interminable, nerve-wracking battles that had to be fought with one's own supreme command before it would accept the need for any urgent military action. The extent to which this wish preoccupied me at that time is apparent from a remark made by my GSOI, the then Colonel Buss, to the chief engineer of Sixth Army just after Christmas 1942. According to the latter, Buss's words were, "If I had not kept begging him, Manstein, to stay for the troops' sake, he'd have chucked the job back at Hitler long ago." This impulsive utterance by the man who was then my closest collaborator is the best indication of my attitude and position. But let me make a few general remarks here on the question of a senior commander's resignation in the field. The first point is that a senior commander is no more able to pack up and go home than any other soldier. Hitler was not compelled to accept a resignation, and would hardly have been likely to do so in this case. The soldier in the field is not in the pleasant position of a politician, who is always at liberty to climb off the bandwagon when things go wrong, or the line taken by the government does not suit him. The soldier has to fight where and when he is ordered. There are admittedly cases where a senior commander cannot reconcile it with his responsibilities to carry out an order he has been given. Then, like Seydlitz at the Battle of Zorndorf, he has to say, "After the battle the king may dispose of my head as he will, but during the battle he will kindly allow me to make use of it." No general can vindicate his loss of a battle by claiming that he was compelled, against his better judgment, to execute an order that led to defeat. In this case, the only course open to him is that of disobedience, for which he is answerable with his head. Success will usually decide whether he was right or not. This was my reason on 19th December for giving Sixth Army that order immediately to break out to the southwest, contrary to an express directive from Hitler. The fact that the order did not achieve anything is due to the failure of Sixth Army headquarters to carry it out. It will hardly ever be possible to decide conclusively whether the latter was right to forego this one remaining chance of salvation, as no one can tell whether the breakout would have succeeded or not. On later occasions, too, I acted contrary to Hitler's orders whenever it was absolutely necessary to do so. Success proved me right, and Hitler had to tolerate my disobedience. Unauthorized action was not admissible, however, when it would have landed the adjacent army groups in trouble. This question of resignation has another aspect, however, besides the one mentioned above. I refer to the feeling of responsibility which a senior commander must have towards his soldiers. At the time in question, I had not only Sixth Army to consider. The fate of my entire army group was at stake, as well as that of Army Group A. To throw up my task at this moment, however justifiable the human motives might be in the light of Hitler's attitude over the capitulation of Sixth Army, struck me as a betrayal of those brave troops who were also involved in a life-and-death struggle outside the Stalingrad pocket. The fact that Don Army Group subsequently succeeded in mastering one of the most difficult situations of the war served, in my own opinion, to justify my decision that day not to resign out of sheer disgust. Just how vital Sixth Army's bitter resistance had been may be gathered from a short sketch of developments in the areas of Don Army Group and Army Groups A and B in January 1943. On 29th December, OKH had finally given in to the insistence of Don Army Group and ordered the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus, initially by taking its left wing, 1st Panzer Army, back onto the Kuma line Pyatigorsk-Praskovaya, 155 miles southeast of Salsk. Because of the time needed to salvage equipment, the move proceeded extraordinarily slowly, and no forces became free for the time being. By 9th January, the date of Sixth Army's rejection of the surrender call, 1st Panzer Army had still not reached the Kuma line. 4th Panzer Army, whose task was to cover the rear of Army Group A, south of the Don, and simultaneously to keep its communications through Rostov open, had been pushed back to the west through Kotelnikovo after some heavy fighting against a much superior enemy, 3 armies strong, south of the Don. By 9th January, it was fighting hard defensive battles along the Kubale, between the Sal and the Manish, and we could see that the enemy intended to envelop it from both flanks. His 3 Guards tank corps, on the Don around Konstantinovka, was swinging southeast and driving on Proletarskaya in the rear of 4th Panzer Army. Similarly, along the Manich, the Soviet 28th Army, newly arrived from the Kalmyk steppes, was trying to execute an outflanking movement to the south. Army Detachment Hollet, after some heavy fighting in the large bend of the Don, had to retire to the Kagalnik sector. Even here the enemy had already broken into the southern flank of its positions, a small enemy force having crossed the Don northeast of Novocherkassk, the location of Army Group headquarters, on 7th of January. On the northern wing of the army detachment, 7 Panzer Division was trying to delay the enemy's approach to the Donets crossing at Forchstadt by local shock tactics. The crossing at Kamensk could only be covered by emergency units and the few Romanians who had not disappeared from the battlefield. Northwest from this point stretched the enormous gap left by the disintegration of the Italian army. Fighting around Milerovo, for a time almost completely surrounded, was the weak Freta-Pico battle group belonging to Army Group B. On 24th January, the day 6th Army finally crumbled into 3 tightly packed groups in and around Stalingrad, and could no longer tie down any Soviet forces worth mentioning. The situation on the rest of the front was as follows. The northern wing of Army Group A was still around Belaya Glina and, even further south, east of Armavir, which meant that it was 125 miles from Rostov. The withdrawal of the bulk of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov had now been finally approved by OKH. Of Don Army Group, 4th Panzer Army was fighting desperately southeast of Rostov to keep the Don crossing clear for 1st Panzer Army, which I envisaged throwing onto the left wing of my army group to hold the Donets from Voroshilovgrad upwards. Army Detachment Hollet was defending the Donets from its junction with the Don up to a point above Forchstadt. The Freta Pico Battle Group, consisting of 2 dilapidated divisions, was guarding the Donets on both sides of Kamensk. Since 19th of January, in consequence of the disintegration of the Italian and Hungarian armies, the latter too having meanwhile been overrun on the Don, there had been a gap some 200 miles wide from Voroshilovgrad on the Donets to Voronezh on the Don. On 23rd of January, the front as far as Starobielsk had been placed under Don Army Group. Practically the only troops left there were those of 19 Panzer Division, which was already pretty battered after giving up Starobielsk in the face of 3 Soviet Army Corps. When the last resistance of 6th Army ceased on 1st February, the enemy was threatening to cross the Donets in the Voroshilovgrad area with a group of 3 tank, 1 mechanized and 1 rifle corps, and appeared to have thrown another group of 3 or 4 tank corps and 1 rifle corps against the line of the river from Lysychansk to Slaviansk. There would seem to be little point in discussing how the situation would have developed between 9th January and 1st February, or what might have happened subsequently, had not the enemy been tied down so long at Stalingrad by the heroic resistance of 6th Army. Now let us return to the army's final struggle. On 24th January, the front broke down into 3 small pockets, one in the centre of Stalingrad and the other 2 on its northern and southern perimeters. On 31st January, the army commander, meanwhile promoted field marshal, was taken prisoner with his staff. On 1st February, the last of the fighting came to an end when what was left of 11 Corps also surrendered in the north of the city. The struggle of 6th Army was over. Soviet captivity was to finish off a process of decline begun by the utter ruthlessness of the fighting, pitiless hunger, and the icy cold of the Russian steppes. The soldiers who suffered it had surrendered only when their arms were powerless to bear weapons and their hands too frozen to operate them, when the exhaustion of their ammunition left them defenceless in the face of an overwhelming foe. Thanks to the self-sacrifice of the German air crews, however, it had still been possible to evacuate some 30,000 wounded from the pocket. Anyone seeking to fix the responsibility for the tragedy of Stalingrad already has the answer from Hitler's own lips. On 5th February, I was summoned to Supreme Headquarters, all my pleas to Hitler to come and see the situation on our front for himself, or at least to send the Chief of Staff or General Jodl, having failed to move him. Hitler opened the interview with roughly these words: "I alone bear the responsibility for Stalingrad. I could perhaps put some of the blame on Goering by saying that he gave me an incorrect picture of the Luftwaffe's potentialities, but he has been appointed by me as my successor, and as such I cannot charge him with the responsibility for Stalingrad." It was certainly to Hitler's credit that he accepted responsibility unreservedly in this instance, and made no attempt whatever to find a scapegoat. On the other hand, we are confronted by his regrettable failure to draw any conclusions for the future from a defeat for which his own errors of leadership were to blame. Yet there is one fact which overshadows the question of responsibility, and all that the ruthlessness of captivity, brainwashing, and justified bitterness may have subsequently done to affect the attitude of many an individual member of the sacrificed army. By their incomparable bravery and devotion to duty, the officers and men of the army raised a memorial to German arms which, though not of stone or bronze, will nonetheless survive the ages. It is an invisible memorial, engraved with the words prefacing this account of the greatest of soldiers' tragedies. The following are the headquarters staffs and formations of 6th Army which perished at Stalingrad: HQ 4, 8 and 11 Corps, and HQ 14 Panzer Corps: 44, 71, 76, 79, 94, 113, 295, 297, 305, 371, 376, 384, and 389 Infantry Divisions, 100 Rifle Jaeger Division, and 369 Croatian Regiment, 14, 16 and 24 panzer divisions, 3, 29 and 60 motorized divisions, as well as numerous army and army group troops, anti-aircraft units, and ground units of the Luftwaffe. Finally, there were 1 Romanian cavalry division and 20 Romanian infantry division. While the eyes of all Germany were on Stalingrad at the turn of 1942-3, and anxious hearts prayed for the sons who fought there, the southern wing of the Eastern Front was simultaneously the scene of a struggle even greater than that being waged for the lives and freedom of Sixth Army's gallant 200,000. The issue was no longer the fate of a single army, but of the entire southern wing of the front and ultimately of all the German armies in the East. This struggle was spared the tragedy of defeat, being ultimately marked, for the last time in World War II, by a brief glimpse of victory. But it embraced, quite apart from its initial association with the trials of Sixth Army, such a wealth of unprecedented tensions and well-nigh fatal crises that the campaign may be regarded as one of the most exciting of the war. On the German side, there could no longer be any question of this being one last bid for the palm of final victory. Indeed, thanks to the errors of leadership in the summer and autumn campaigns of 1942, the principal aim, at least to begin with, could only be, in the words of Schlieffen, to bring defeat underfoot. In the face of an enemy whose manifold superiority offered him every chance of victory, the German command had to improvise again and again, and the fighting troops to perform unparalleled feats. Though its end was marked by neither the fanfares of victory nor the muffled drum beats which accompanied Sixth Army's death march, this battle still deserves recording. As a withdrawal operation, it must inevitably be devoid of glory. Yet the fact that, far from ending in defeat, it offered the Supreme Command one more chance of achieving at least a military stalemate was possibly something more than an ordinary victory. In order to appreciate the significance of this decisive campaign on the southern wing, and the magnitude of the dangers it involved, we must briefly consider the operational position at its inception. In the winter of 1941-2, Russia's military resources had only sufficed to halt the German attack on Moscow, and with it the German campaign as a whole. Then, in the summer of 1942, the tide had surged eastwards again, finally to ebb on the Volga and in the Caucasus. But now, in the winter of 1942-3, the enemy at last felt strong enough to wrest the initiative from us. The question henceforth was whether that winter would bring the decisive step towards Germany's defeat in the East. Momentous and distressing though the Stalingrad disaster undoubtedly was, it could not, in terms of World War II, effect such a blow on its own, whereas the annihilation of the German army's entire southern wing might well have paved the way to an early victory over Germany. There were 2 reasons why the Soviet High Command could hope to attain this goal in the south of the Eastern Front. One was the extraordinary numerical superiority of the Russian forces. The second was the favourable position it found itself in operationally as a result of the German errors of leadership associated with the name of Stalingrad. It undoubtedly strove after this goal, even if it did not succeed in reaching it. Let me first give a short account of the strategic situation at the start of this winter campaign in South Russia. The German front in November 1942 formed a wide arc curving far out to the east in the area of the Caucasus and eastern Ukraine. The right wing of this arc touched the Black Sea at Novorossiysk and continued along the front of Army Group A, 17th Army and 1st Panzer Army, through the northern Caucasus without actually linking up with the Caspian Sea in the east. The deep open flank of this front, which faced southwards, had only 16 motorized division to cover it in the direction of the lower Volga in the east. The division was located in the Kalmyk steppes east of Yalista. The continuous front of Army Group B only began at a point south of Stalingrad. From Stalingrad, it receded to the Don and then ran along the latter as far as Voronezh. In it were 4th Romanian Army, 4th Panzer Army, 6th Army, 3rd Romanian Army, 1 Italian and 1 Hungarian Army, and then the 2nd German Army. The bulk of the German forces had for months past been bunched around Stalingrad, while the rest of the front, in particular the line of the Don, was entrusted mainly to Allied armies. There were no reserves worth speaking of behind the fronts of either Army Group A or B. The enemy, whose armies formed a Caucasus front, a Southwest front, and a Voronezh front, had not only superior forces in the line, but also powerful reserves behind these army groups and the central or Moscow sector of the Eastern Front, as well as in the hinterland. In order to grasp the true danger of this situation and the full extent to which it benefited the enemy, one must try to picture one or two distances of strategic significance. The distance to the Don crossing at Rostov from the Don sector in which 3rd Romanian Army was overrun on 19th November, i.e., opposite and west of the Russians' Don bridgehead at Kremenskaya, as well as from that occupied by the Italian army on each side of Kasanskaya, amounted to only a little more than 185 miles. Through Rostov ran the rear communications not only of the whole of Army Group A, but also of 4th Romanian and 4th Panzer Army. Yet the left wing of Army Group A was at least 375 miles from Rostov, while 4th Panzer Army, in its location south of Stalingrad, was some 250 miles away. Further back, the lines of communication of the German army's southern wing led across the Dnieper crossings of Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk. The connection through the Crimea and across the Straits of Kerch was not a very efficient one. These vital Dnieper crossings in the rear of the German southern wing lay some 440 miles from Stalingrad and more than 560 miles from the left wing of the Caucasus front. On the other hand, they were only about 260 miles from the enemy front on the Don, measuring either from Kasanskaya to Zaporozhye or from Svoboda to Dnepropetrovsk. What this situation could mean in practice I knew only too well from personal experience, having in summer 1941 covered the odd 190 miles from Tilsit to Dvinsk in 4 days with 56 Panzer Corps. I had done so, moreover, against opposition that was certainly tougher than anything the Italian and Hungarian armies could offer on the Don. At that time, the Russians had also had very many more reserves behind their front than were available to us in the winter of 1942. Added to this strategic advantage was the Russians' immense preponderance of numbers. The ratio of forces at the beginning of Don Army Group's struggle has already been shown in the chapter on Stalingrad. How it developed in the course of the winter may be gathered from 2 figures. In March 1943, the number of divisions at the disposal of Southern, formerly Don Army Group on the 435-mile front from the Sea of Azov to north of Kharkov, was 32. Facing this sector, either in or behind the line, were 341 enemy formations, consisting of rifle divisions, armoured or mechanized brigades, and cavalry divisions. Thus, the conditions under which Don Army Group had to fight were constantly governed by 2 factors. First, an overwhelming superiority of numbers. Even when the Army Group, augmented by the bulk of 1st Panzer Army and new forces supplied by OKH, consisted of 3 and later 4 German armies, the ratio of German to enemy forces was still 1.7. This allows for the numerical inferiority of certain Russian formations when compared to German divisions. Secondly, there was a strategic danger inherent in the fact that an enemy who was stronger than ourselves, and who for a time enjoyed complete freedom of action following the collapse of the Allied armies, had shorter distances to travel to the lifelines of the German southern wing, Rostov and the Dnieper crossings, than we had. Taken in conjunction with one another, these 2 factors implied a danger that the southern wing, once cut off from its supplies, would be pushed back against the coast of the Sea of Azov or Black Sea and ultimately destroyed, as the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was just as capable as ever of imposing a blockade. After the destruction of Don Army Group and Army Group A, however, the fate of the entire Eastern Front would have been sealed sooner or later. By virtue of the initial strategic situation outlined above, the whole battle on the southern wing in the winter of 1942-3, and it was destined to be the battle in the east that winter, boiled down to the same question on both sides. Would the Soviets succeed in trapping the German southern wing, thereby accomplishing the decisive step towards their final victory, Or would the German command be able to avert such a catastrophe? The operational plan for the Russians to adopt was obvious enough. It had been offered them on a silver platter when the German Supreme Command allowed the front to petrify in the final phase of the summer offensive. Nothing was more natural than that the Soviets should first seize their chance to trap Sixth Army as it lay bunched around Stalingrad. In the further course of operations, the enemy was to be expected to cash in on his knockout successes in the Romanian, Italian and Hungarian sectors, and to try, by striking again and again in ever-increasing strength and scope, to outflank the German southern wing to the north and west. His object had to be to amputate this wing from its communications zones and ultimately to box it in on the sea coast. It was a strategic concept that derived every possible encouragement from the situation in which the German southern wing had been left for far too long by the Supreme Command. On the German side, there was the much harder problem of deciding how to escape from the danger in which we had been landed by our own omissions and the enemy's first unexpected successes on both sides of Stalingrad. In view of the overall strategic situation, however, our Supreme Command should have realized from the first day of the enemy attack how things would develop, and in particular, how dangerously exposed was Army Group A in the Caucasus. Broadly speaking, the German Supreme Command had to choose between two courses. The first would have been to disengage Sixth Army from the Volga immediately after it had begun to be attacked and before it could be tightly surrounded, and then to try to restore the situation in the large bend of the Don with the help of strong reinforcements. At the same time, it would have been necessary to shore up the Allied-occupied Don sectors with German forces. Obviously, however, the Supreme Command neither had the necessary troops available for this solution, nor could it, in view of the low capacity of the few existing railways, have brought them up in time. To take Sixth Army away from Stalingrad was something it could not make up its mind to do. Indeed, not many weeks after the start of the Soviet offensive, it was clear that the army was to be lost for good, and that the best it could do within the framework of the operation as a whole was to tie down the largest possible body of forces for the longest possible period. It was a task which the gallant army fulfilled till the end, and for which it ultimately sacrificed itself. Nevertheless, even after events had taken such an ominous turn as a result of the obstinate way in which Hitler clung to Stalingrad, and after all hope of extricating Sixth Army had proved illusory, there was still a second course open to the Supreme Command. At the cost of surrendering the territory won in the summer campaign, which could not be held anyway, a grave crisis could have been turned into victory. To this end, it would have been necessary to withdraw the forces of Don Army Group and Army Group A from the front's eastward protuberance according to fixed timings, taking them first behind the lower Don or Donets, and subsequently to the lower Dnieper. In the meantime, any forces that could possibly be made available, including those divisions of either army group which became disengaged through the shortening of the front, would have had to be concentrated, let us say, somewhere around Kharkov. On them would have devolved the task of driving into the flank of the enemy as he pursued the retiring army groups or attempted to cut them off from the Dnieper crossings. In other words, the idea would have been to convert a large-scale withdrawal into an envelopment operation, with the aim of pushing our pursuer back against the sea and destroying him there. Don Army Group proposed this solution to OKH when there was no longer any prospect of relieving Sixth Army, and as soon as it became plain that Army Group A's position in the Caucasus was untenable and that the enemy breakthrough on the Italian front threatened to cut off the entire southern wing. But Hitler was not the man to embark on a course which initially committed him to relinquish the conquests of summer 1942 and would unquestionably have entailed considerable operational hazards. Such a step was entirely out of keeping with the personality I have already analysed in the chapter on Hitler as a supreme commander. With his lack of experience in operational matters, he may even then have hoped to restore the situation on the southern wing by throwing in the SS Panzer Corps, which was moving up to Kharkov. As far as Don Army Group headquarters was concerned, the first of the above-mentioned courses had already been ruled out before it arrived on the scene, for by that time Sixth Army had been completely surrounded. Neither the battered remnants handed over to us as Don Army Group, nor the thin trickle of reinforcements we were getting, could possibly suffice to fight a battle in the large bend of the Don with any prospect of success, even less so after the reinforcements had been held up in Army Group B's sector following the defeat of the Italian army. As for the second course, that of turning a large-scale withdrawal operation into a counterblow against the enemy's northern flank, as he inevitably exposed this in the course of his pursuit, Don Army Group lacked the absolute authority to take it. To do so, we should have required power of command over the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front, and freedom to do what we liked with the OKH reserves. Instead, the Army Group was committed to deal in turn with the tasks which presented themselves in its allotted sphere of command. It had to devise one stopgap after another to meet a danger which arose from the original strategic situation and grew increasingly acute as time went on. The danger that the entire southern wing would be tied off. The first task confronting the Army Group was the relief of 6th Army. Initially, this had to take precedence over all other operational considerations. Once this task had proved insoluble for the reasons already related in the chapter on Stalingrad, the Army Group had to tackle the problem of preventing the even greater catastrophe of the loss of the whole southern wing. As the forces still available as reserves to OKH were not enough to keep the southern wing's lines of communication over the lower Don and Dnieper open, the only course left to us was to gather in the eastern wing of the Army Group and throw the forces thus released over to the western wing. Everything depended then on our always thinking far enough ahead to switch forces from our eastern to our western wing, in time to intercept the enemy's outflanking movements as they gradually extended further and further west. It was a task rendered all the more difficult by the fact that the neighbouring formation in the north, Army Group B, was slowly but surely disappearing from sight as a result of the loss of the Allied armies. On the other hand, it was not possible to shift forces to the western wing in sufficient numbers without calling on forces from Army Group A, which was not under Don Army Group's orders. Though conceived on a larger scale and extending over a longer period, it was the same task that had confronted General Paulus at Stalingrad between 19th and 23rd November. This time, too, it was a matter of moving forces promptly and regardless of local repercussions to the places on which the survival of our rear communications depended, and simultaneously of maintaining our operational mobility. The only difference was that in General Paulus's case, the decision had been compressed into a few days, or perhaps even hours, and that he could count on no reinforcements whatever to begin with. In our own case, however, this idea was to govern our whole approach to operations and involve us in months of conflict with the Supreme Command. In essence, the idea of leapfrogging from east to west to parry the enemy's attempts to tie off the southern wing was an extremely simple one. In war, however, it is so often the simple things which prove hardest to carry out, the real difficulties lying not so much in the taking of a decision as in its unswerving execution. In the present instance, any withdrawal of forces from the eastern wing was bound to create a danger there which no one could be sure of surviving. Above all, if these shifts of forces were to have a timely effect, they must be initiated some time, if not several weeks, before the danger of being cut off had become so acute as to be acknowledged by Hitler. Last but not least, developments in Army Group A's sector, as will be seen later, long prevented us from putting the leapfrog plan into practice. And so, simple and self-evident though it was, this basic approach of ours proved difficult to implement consistently in the face of the increasing gravity of the situation. The same difficulty was experienced in getting it accepted by the Supreme Command, at least in time for it to have any useful effect, since the latter's views were diametrically opposed to our own. Hitler persisted in the principle of holding rigidly on to his gains, whereas we considered operational mobility, at which our operations staffs and fighting troops had the advantage of the enemy, to be the real key to victory. The situation which confronted it at the time of its takeover, combined with the restrictions imposed on it by the Supreme Command and its far-reaching dependence on the actions and attitudes of the neighbouring army groups, led Don Army Group to adopt a system of stopgaps without, at the same time, ever sacrificing the basic formula. In the light of the foregoing, Don, later Southern Army Group's winter campaign of 1942-3, may be broken down into 4 successive phases. The struggle for the relief of 6th Army, on which the Army Group staked everything it could possibly afford. The Army Group's struggle to keep the rear of Army Group A free while it was being disengaged from the Caucasus front. The actual battle to keep open the lines of communication of the German Army's southern wing and to prevent it from being tied off. The final 4th phase, in which the Army Group succeeded, if on a smaller scale than it would have liked, in delivering the counterblow culminating in the Battle of Kharkov. The attempt to relieve 6th Army, or rather to enable it to break out of the Stalingrad pocket, has already been recounted. In an all-out effort to make this attempt succeed, Don Army Group went to the very limits of what could be risked, right up to the time when the fate of 6th Army was sealed, i.e., the end of December 1942, it endeavoured to manage with a minimum of forces in the centre and on the left of the Army Group front, which only amounted to a thin protective screen as it was. Its object was to delay any decisive developments in these sectors until 4th Panzer Army's battle east of the Don had successfully opened up the beleaguered army's way to freedom. Only after all hope of linking up 4th Panzer and 6th Armies had to be abandoned, and the simultaneous defeat of the Italian army had laid bare Don Army Group's western flank and thrown open the enemy's road to Rostov, did the Army Group concede precedence to the problem of maintaining the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front. All that remains for me to do in this context is to give a brief account of how Don Army Group's situation came to deteriorate as a result, on one hand, of 6th Army's decision not to attempt the breakout, and on the other, of the way things developed on the right wing of Army Group B, the Italian army. The difficult position in which 4th Panzer Army had landed on the eastern wing of the Army Group as the enemy threw in increasingly strong forces from the Stalingrad siege front to meet it has already been indicated. In the battles between the Aksai and Kotelnikovo, as well as in the fighting for the latter as a springboard for 4th Panzer Army's relief offensive, 57 Panzer Corps suffered considerable losses after being left alone on the battlefield by the Romanians. 23 Panzer Division, which had been severely weakened before this, was particularly badly hit. The non-appearance of reinforcements from Army Group A made it unlikely that 4th Panzer Army would even hold its own sufficiently to prevent the enemy from swinging strong forces into the rear of 1st Panzer Army. The trend of events on the rest of the Army Group front was not a whit less serious. In what had been the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, the fact that 4th Panzer Army was falling back east of the Don enabled the enemy to cross the ice-covered river around Potemkinskaya, and a little later at Chimlianskaya, and to threaten the Chir positions in the flank and rear. On this front, General Meath had meanwhile assumed command in place of 3rd Romanian Army headquarters. Since the Russians were coming over the Don from the east and south, we had no choice initially but to order the Meath Group to make a fighting withdrawal behind the Kagalnik. On the left wing of the Army Group, the position looked even more critical. Admittedly, Army Detachment Hollet had succeeded, notwithstanding the loss of the Romanian divisions, in bringing its forces back southwards from the Upper Chir. Without any justification, however, a newly arrived, recently formed division, which was to have taken over the defence of the Army Detachment's flank on the Bistraya Gnilaya, gave up the crossing point at Milyutinsky. This opened the enemy's way into Hollet's flank and also to the important airbase at Morosowski. Far more serious still was the fact that, thanks to the disintegration of the Italian army and the almost complete elimination of the Romanians from the battle, 1 and 2 Romanian Corps on what had been the left wing of Army Detachment Hollet, the enemy was able to make for the Don crossings of Fochstadt, Kamensk and Voroshilovgrad almost unopposed. Only at Milerovo, where the newly formed Fretta Pico group on the right wing of Army Group B stood like a solitary island amid the red flood, was any resistance being offered. In any case, the enemy was free to wheel east into the rear of Army Detachment Hollet or the Meath Group, or alternatively to keep heading south to Rostov. Don Army Group's situation was serious enough, therefore. Had it been acting quite independently, the only correct way to solve the crisis would have been to put the leapfrog principle into effect forthwith, regardless of any other considerations. 4th Panzer Army could have been pulled back to Rostov in one single movement and thereafter used to fight off the threat to the Army Group's left flank and its communications to the west. The forces of the Meath Group and Army Detachment Hollet, still in action in the large bend of the Don, would have had to come back to the Donets. The objection to this solution lay in the fact that Army Group A was still lodged as firmly as ever in its positions in the Caucasus. To expose its rear by shifting Don Army Group's forces over to the western wing was out of the question. On the contrary, it was Don Army Group's duty not only to cover the rear of Army Group A, but also to keep open its lines of communication through Rostov. For the time being, then, the idea of basing the Army Group's operations on the principle of switching their main effort westwards to balk the enemy's attempts to cut off the whole wing of the German armies could still not take effect. During the first few weeks after the takeover, indeed, the Army Group had deliberately shelved it in the interest of 6th Army. Now, in the second phase, it found itself compelled, in spite of the steadily growing threat to its western flank, to embark on a desperate struggle to keep the rear of Army Group A free. The German Supreme Command should really have been aware from the start that Army Group A could not stay in the Caucasus if the battle to free 6th Army did not immediately succeed. In other words, if there were no clear possibility of somehow establishing a reasonably secure situation within the large bend of the Don. But when the enemy tore a gap on the right wing of Army Group B, which opened his way to Rostov, it should have been palpably evident to anyone that there could no longer be any question of holding the Caucasus front. Unless, of course, Hitler had been able or willing to bring in large bodies of troops from other theatres. As early as 20th December, the day when the flight of 2 Italian divisions had exposed the flank of Army Detachment Hollet and cleared the Russians' way to the Donets crossings, I had pointed out to General Zeitzler that by advancing in the direction of Rostov, the enemy would now have his chance to strike the decisive blow against the whole of the German southern wing. On 24th December, I had again drawn attention to the fact that it was now no longer the fate of Don Army Group alone that was at stake, but of Army Group A as well. I have already mentioned the rejection of my demand for the release of forces from Army Group A to Rostov and 4th Panzer Army. Even if one no longer envisaged renewing the attempt to extend a rescuing hand to 6th Army, it was still in Army Group A's interest that 4th Panzer Army should be reinforced, since its defeat would have given the enemy access to the Army Group's rear. Since Army Group A, quite understandably, did not want to hand any units over, it was the business of the Supreme Command to order the equalization of forces so urgently needed between the two army groups. One possible reason for Army Group A's refusal to let us have the divisions we asked for, see the chapter on Stalingrad, may well have been the quite perplexing degree to which its formations and units had been shuffled around and intermingled with one another. Undoubtedly, the disengagement of the larger ones would have been a difficult and at best time-consuming task. This state of affairs was in part the inevitable outcome of a need, in the absence of adequate reserves, to patch up the gaps caused by enemy penetrations. However, it was also due in equal measure to the army groups having for months on end been without a commander of its own to keep things in order. At the best of times, many military commanders are unable to appreciate that units must be left in their normal order of battle if one is to achieve maximum efficiency and preserve maneuverability. When, as in this case, there was no responsible commander whatever for a considerable period, it was hardly surprising if the troops became disorganized. In response to the insistence of Don Army Group, Hitler finally decided on 29th December to order the withdrawal of the eastern and most exposed wing of Army Group A, 1st Panzer Army, to the Kuma sector of Piatigorsk-Praskovaya. Yet he still had no intention of giving up the Caucasus Front as a whole. Evidently, he still hoped that by bending back Army Group A's eastern wing to the Kuma, he would be able to pivot it upon the Manich Flats, thereby stabilizing the situation between the Manich and Don, and simultaneously keeping the communications of the southern wing open across the lower Dnieper. Thus, the balcony, which had been formed in November by pushing the front out into the Caucasus and up to the Volga, and which had led to the unfavourable situation we were in at present, was not to be eliminated, but merely reduced in size. Where, on the other hand, the forces were to be found to compensate for the loss of the Romanian and Italian armies, and before very long the Hungarian one as well, remained a complete mystery. This, in due course, was what caused the remainder of the Caucasus front to be abandoned. In this second phase of its struggle, Don Army Group was confronted with the following tasks. Instead of acting as the situation really demanded and radically shifting the main point of